if the Iranian response to the Israel response, there's a lot of responses, it could blow up into something bigger. But it's certainly, I don't think, in anybody's wish list at this point that this becomes more active than it already is. I think that both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense is spending a lot of time on the phones right now with our allies in the region to ensure that they try and minimize any conflict going forward.
Nathan, in order to get these bills passed, it seems like Speaker Johnson's going to have to make a deal somehow or get some support from the Democrats. Is that going to cost him his job?
We certainly think that the motion to vacate is going to happen. It's probably going to happen not this week, but then when the House of Representatives returns after this is passed. But Speaker Mike Johnson is going to have to use Democratic supports, A, to get these bills across the line, and B, also to save his job. Now, it's been reports that, potentially as part of the Rules Committee for this vote, that they changed the threshold for a motion to vacate rather than just one individual. Maybe it goes back to the Nancy Pelosi era of having somebody in leadership do it. I don't know if that's going to happen or not. But ultimately, Democrats are going to have to get on board with supporting both this package and potentially saving Speaker Mike Johnson's job. And that's just not a good feeling for a GOP House Speaker to have. Mm-hmm. Now, he does have the saving grace that we have an election in 9 months, and nobody wants to go through another election of a House Speaker battle, the one that took 3 weeks before. So I think Speaker Johnson is trying to call their bluff. I think eventually he can call their bluff. But after the election, it really depends on who takes the House and what the thresholds and margins are.
But this is where I feel like the two stories that Paul and I are talking about come together. Like, how do we square voting for the packages when the headlines get scarier and scarier overseas? And in many ways, the one lever the U.S. has is money.
So, in terms of aid, well, think about it this way. There's two ways to think about it. One is the support for our allies in the region, and the second is direct American involvement. Support for our allies in the region really has to come from Congress. I mean, obviously the United States has a lot of power under the presidency to do this, but in terms of actually providing hard, cold cash, that comes from Congress, and it's going to be most likely this $95.3 billion deal. The next one comes in terms of just active U.S. support. And this is where the president can actually direct the powers of the Department of Defense and state and so forth like that. So when it comes to those scarier headlines that you're referring to, President Biden really doesn't need Congress to help him with that. It's really just a political decision at the White House and using the executive branch. So, in terms of the two, if Congress can get their job done and pass this package, then it solely just is up to President Biden to see it through the finish line.
All right, we'll pay attention this weekend. Saturday could have some fireworks here coming out of the halls of Congress. And I know Nathan will be all over it. Nathan Dean, Senior Policy Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, joining us from Washington, D.C. Again, it sounds like if Speaker Johnson wants to get these bills through, he's going to put his job on the line as Speaker.
How many times are we going to be saying that?
I know.
It's just, I don't understand.
I don't understand.
I don't understand. If I ran my household and my budgeting like this, yes, I would be on the street. Like, there's no way.
I know, but I guess what the experts tell us is that's what happens when you have such a evenly split Congress. Literally, a handful of members on either side can make or break the whole legislative calendar. And then if you're the Speaker, it's your job to kind of herd the cats, I guess.
Well, coming up, we're going to talk about John Waldron of Goldman Sachs, who's the president there, and his big warning. And he sounds an alarm for U.S. markets, and we're going to talk about what that alarm actually is. If you take a look at an equity market, we're still up on the day, a little off the highs of the session, though. This is Bloomberg.
general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe one stage or two stages ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. What does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down that path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to like build a path towards that. It's almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. Think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there, and who do you need to work with, upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do 3 things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So it's strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
When I was younger, I used to be in bands. I'd play drums in bands and toured America with them, did a lot of session drumming, recorded albums. So yeah, it was good fun doing the drumming. The only reason I stopped it, well, I still play, but not as serious as I did when I was younger. But drumming doesn't pay the bills. I was never good enough to be able to pay the bills with it, but it was good fun. I started RJF, and the reason I started it was I saw a gap in the market for particular early stage and startup businesses. With the experience that I've got of running businesses, of being a finance director at the very biggest companies in the world to being finance director of small startups, we were looking at providing more than just basic accountancy services. So yes, we'll do all that. We'll do all the basic, all the statutory side of things that you need to do. But there's so much more value that we can add, and I wanted to have my experience to help these startups, because a lot of them don't really know where to go. You can go to your high street accountants and they can do a good job compliance-wise, but you would question whether they've actually been in the fire line of a business. Have you been in a business where you're thinking, how do I pay wages next week? Or business is really successful, what do we do with it next? Or how do we grow it? How do we grow into international territories? Or how do we grow our markets? How do we expand? So a lot of the experience I've seen over the years and seen different types of business in different sectors, I thought, well, it's a real value that I can add to these businesses as opposed to just being an FD, because a lot of these businesses can't afford an FD. But if we can take care of their statutory side of things, the compliance side of things, I'm on hand to be able to help and advise businesses with their growth strategy, or if they're in difficulty, help them through these times.
F. Kennedy Jr.
We're doing that because we feel that the stakes are so high.
With the decision to highlight the Kennedy family endorsement more than 6 months from Election Day, may be an indication of how seriously Biden's team is taking the threat of the long-shot bid by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Well, the bitter fight over SALT continues. Advisors to Donald Trump want to cut the state and local tax write-off limit to below $10,000. That story from Bloomberg's Jeff Bellinger.
Stephen Moore and Arthur Laffer, who are regularly meeting with Trump to pitch him on economic policy ideas, say they are staunchly opposed to any increase to the $10,000 write-off cap on state and local taxes, or SALT. That limit was imposed in Trump's 2017 tax law and will expire at the end of 2025, along with other key portions of the law. Laffer says he is against any type of state and local deductions on the federal level. The $10,000 cap was felt most acutely in high-tax states, including New York and New Jersey. Jeff Bellinger, Bloomberg Radio.
And the first model of the USS Enterprise, used in the opening credits of the original Star Trek television series, has boldly gone back home, returning to creator Gene Roddenberry's son decades after it went missing. The model's disappearance sometime in the 1970s had kind of become the subject of lore, so it caused quite a stir when it popped up on eBay last fall. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker. This is Bloomberg. You sure I'm not filling in for you?
I'm sure. I think Danny's doing the 10, and then Paul's solo. We can't get enough of Paul solo.
Yeah, why not?
As far as I know.
Sure.
But, you know.
I'll be here just in case.
At this point, tomorrow I'll be on the beach, so.
Nice.
Whatever.
And what is your beach drink of choice?
Ooh, is this when I drank a lot, or is this now?
Well, just...
Because these are different things.
We're not going back to high school or college. We're just saying,
Oh, I'm talking like 4 years ago. Okay. I like me some rum punch. I mean, I don't mind a nice brewski also on the beach.
Okay.
Try a rum jumbie. That'll do it for you.
What's that? What's in that one?
I don't know, but it's good.
The thing is, you have too much sugar, then like it hits you. And actually, the last time I went on these vacations, it was the Prosecco, gin, and Saint Germain. That was my
all
together. So good.
Really?
Yes. At some point, like the waiter was like, "Are you sure you want all of those together?" And I was like, "I am 100% sure." He's
I
like,
know what I'm doing.
"That's a lot of alcohol." I'm like, "But give it to me."
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you got a new leaf.
It was fun.
Okay.
It was fun stories.
All right,
well.
Very good. All right. So enjoy the beach. How about Goldman Sachs? John Waldron.
Yeah.
Alumnus of the Lawrenceville School. He's a little concerned about the marketplace.
Yeah, so he was talking to an event in D.C. from Semaphore saying that the thing he worries about is the confluence of a political crisis and a lot of leverage in the Treasury system. He's basically warning about the jumbo amount of debt that the U.S. has, and he compares it to the U.K. and the liability-driven investment disaster that happened back in 2022 when yields spiked and had a real issue with budget deficits, et cetera. I mean, the thing with this is, haven't we known this forever?
Yes.
So when does it become an actual
I don't. It's my
issue?
entire lifetime we've been talking about the ballooning U.S. deficit and annual deficits and the debt and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. But with interest rates moving higher, maybe it's a bigger issue. All right, balance of power with Joe Matthew from Washington, D.C. That's coming at you right now.
Politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
At least Mike Johnson has Democrats on his side. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, as Democrats in the House line up behind the Speaker's plans to fund Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, even as his own Republican conference in many cases works to block it. We've got breaking news ahead. From Bloomberg's Eric Wasson, reporting from Capitol Hill today, we'll have insights from Bill Hoagland at the Bipartisan Policy Center. The Harvard Institute of Politics is out with its latest youth poll, and it brings reasons to worry for both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. We'll talk to Harvard's John Della Volpe with analysis, from our panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist Rick Davis, joined today by Brad Howard, founder of the Corcoran Street Group. So let's get started, as always, with a look at Wall Street. For that, we turn to Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Indeed, stocks higher across the board right now. We are off session highs, but still looking at a 25-point gain for the S&P 500 index, trading right now at 5,047. That is an advance of 0.5%. Dow Industrials up 243 points, up 0.6%. NASDAQ right now up 73. That is a gain of 0.5%. 1%. 10-year, 4.63% with a 2-year, 4.97%. We've got spot gold up 1% at $23.84 on an ounce of the precious metal. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.1%, $82.77. 10-year, 4.63. The 2-year again, 4.97%. International Monetary Fund Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva says she still sees a potential for the Federal Reserve to lower rates in 2024. And in a Bloomberg radio interview this morning, she said the Fed is right to be standing pat for now.
On the interest rates, the Fed is doing the right thing. They're watchful. Keep your eye on the ball. And at this point, the ball is bouncing up and down, and the Fed is not yet prepared, and rightly so, to cut.
The IMF managing director was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Radio. Netflix after the bell. Today, investors have big expectations for the streaming giant's first quarter results, which bulls are hoping will support a rally back toward record levels for the stock. Netflix today up 0.4%. And repeating an earlier headline, Brevin Howard cutting more than 100 employees to reduce costs. Recapping S&P up 25, up 0.5. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington. And once again, here's your host, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. It's Little Friday, and we pick up in Washington right where we left off yesterday with big questions about how this is all going to work in the U.S. House when it comes to funding for Ukraine, for Israel, and Taiwan. The fourth bill, by the way, did eventually drop. This is the divest or ban TikTok bill. It's got the repo money and apparently some Iranian sanctions. The question is, will all of this pass? And it looks like the answer may be yes, but only with the help of Democrats. The headline on the terminal today, Eric Wasson reporting from Capitol Hill, Ukraine-Israel aid on track to pass as Democrats back plan. That's not going to help his standing, most likely, with the Freedom Caucus today, but it might get the job done with questions about his potential to be fired in the middle of all this. With a motion to vacate now, 2 lawmakers on it. We can get into that as well with Eric in a moment, but I will point you to another headline. The White House is not waiting. U.S. readies Ukraine package that can be sent when aid bill passes. Bloomberg News also reporting the Biden administration preparing a military aid shipment the minute he signs the bill. So the gears are turning here. It's just a question exactly how all of this is going to end. And Eric Wasson has been in the halls of Congress all day, joins us right now with the latest on this. Eric, we've got to pass a rule first, right? This is the hard part for Mike Johnson. What's the latest?
You know, I got to emphasize to the listeners, this is real. My base case is this Ukraine package is going to pass. I mean, this is really on track here. Democrats are lining up. Of course, they're saying we want to see the rules, we want to see the details, but you know, the momentum is here. The die is cast. This fourth bill that materialized does not have poison pills. There's some question about liquid natural gas exports being put in there, a top priority for the speaker. He did not put that in there, knowing Democrats didn't like it. The stuff that is in there, the TikTok ban, very popular in both parties. In fact, they even made it more popular by giving TikTok until after the election to be dealt with. So there's no real chance that you're going to have young people streaming to the polls to oust politicians for banning their favorite social media app. I mean, this is really, the glide path has really been set. As you said, the real question is, would Johnson, face an ouster threat? I just came from extraordinary scrum with Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert, who are irate. There's, some talk among Republicans of trying to defang this motion to vacate, to make it more difficult, make sure there's more people have to be on board to raise this. And they basically told the speaker moments ago on the House floor, if you do that, we're going to pull the motion to vacate right now. We're going to fire this gun before you take it away. Wow. So I just think that they're very angry with him about that. I think he's going to probably have to back off, but we'll see. That's something going on behind the scenes. They might insert this into the rule of the Ukraine bill because it's going to need Democrats anyhow.
So that you just said a lot, Eric, just to unpack a little bit of that, the motion to vacate, there was a movement that would require more than one lawmaker, right? That would make it more difficult to fire the speaker. It sounds like that movement might be going down in flames. Will there be a rule, though, Eric, or does the speaker have to suspend rules and use Democrats to pass these?
No, there's going to be a rule vote. It's an interesting combination of things. There's Democrats who, object to the Israel bill. This is all going to come up under a rule. I just think what's going to happen is very extraordinary here. Democrats in the Rules Committee and on the floor are going to have to vote for it. I know this sounds all very procedural, but basically this is usually a shirts and skins type of vote, like the party in charge votes for the rules, sets the debate, and the party out of power votes against it. But this has there is precedent for crossing the lines. In May, on the debt ceiling vote, when the U.S. was facing a payments default, Democrats, 52 of them, crossed the line to make sure that debate could start on that bill. So, they've done this before, and I think that's where we're headed right now.
There was an attempt to move a border bill through the Rules Committee that did not work out last night, Eric. Chip Roy, of course, a Republican from Texas, Freedom Caucus, and a thorn in the side of the Speaker, wrote, "Sorry, not sorry for opposing a crappy rule that is a show vote, cover vote for funding Ukraine instead of border security." Does that mean there will be no border component here, or is it up in the air?
Well, there was not going to be a border component. There was going to be a separate vote, and that was really something to sort of like, a distraction, basically. I think Roy is correct. If you're not going to put it in the package, just holding that vote, the House has already passed a border security bill that's dead in the Senate. If it's not attached to Ukraine, this would be dead as well. So it was something kind of like, a gimme, and they were like, we're not having any part of that. We're not going to allow to do that. It's interesting. The Speaker puts out fact sheets on this Ukraine bill, and he mentions border, but if you know what's going on, the border is not part of it.
Lastly, Eric, I just wonder the evolution of the Speaker. If you can talk about this. This Ukraine funding has been very controversial. He's been talking about how we need to secure our own border first. But his words yesterday were powerful as he talked to reporters, and I think you were standing there. He said, "I think he might go to the Balkans next," referring to Vladimir Putin. He said, "I really do believe the intel and the briefings that we've gotten. I believe Putin, and Iran really are an axis of evil. I think they're in coordination on it." Did he get an intelligence briefing recently that changed his mind?
He's had a bunch of them, and I've talked to him for several months over this. I think he's been supportive of Ukraine aid. He's just trying to find the right way to do it, to be respectful of his caucus. But at the end of the day, he is a man of principle, a man of strong faith. He's a devout Christian, but also just a man of, he's been a defense officer. This is someone who was on the Armed Services Committee. And I think he's made the calculation, he's going to stand by his principles. If he gets ousted, as he said later in that press conference, he can't live under the threat of being ousted. It'd be like any of us living on the threat of being fired, constantly panicking about it, worried. You can't really live life like that. So I think he's just decided, he's going to try his best. And if they do oust him, he's had a career. He'll find something else to do.
He's had a career. Eric, thank you. Eric Wasson, live on Capitol Hill. Great reporting. Eric has been a news machine, which is why you see his byline all over the terminal and the website. When the news breaks, he'll have it for you. He's been living outside the Speaker's office, and great to have him with us here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. There are questions, of course, about whether the Speaker could get fired here. And based on what we just heard from Eric, it's not going to get any more difficult, at least, to fire a Speaker of the House. There was a thought that they might increase the threshold required, but that doesn't appear, based on what we just heard from Eric, to be clearing the Rules Committee. We talked to Congressman Adam Smith about this yesterday, Democrat from Washington, about the idea of Democrats coming to potentially save Mike Johnson, to either leave the chamber or actually vote for him to be Speaker. He's ready to do that. Listen to what he said.
I, for one, will not vote to remove Speaker Johnson. And I know a number of other Democrats feel the same way that I do. There's kind of this coy little thing back and forth as to whether or not we say that publicly. I tend to be more blunt and straightforward than most members, so I'm not going to be coy about it. It doesn't serve the interests of Congress or the country to remove the Speaker at this point, and he's carried through with his pledge to not abandon Ukraine, to give us a vote on Ukraine. And as long as he's done that, I'm certainly not going to agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene about who the Speaker of the House should be.
How about it? So Democrats are not just lining up to help pass these bills, they're maybe lining up to save his job, which would answer one of the two big questions we have today. Is the Speaker going to get fired for this? And what will happen in the Senate when this legislation, set to pass, we're told, goes next door? That's what we want to talk to Bill Hoagland about. Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center, and worked a career in the Senate before his time across the street from us here in downtown Washington. Bill, it's great to have you back. Is the Senate just ready to pass this thing, or is J.D. Vance, is Rand Paul and others set to slow it down?
No, I think, first of all, if it does pass out of the House, it will be, the three bills will be bundled into one under the rule. As we speak, the Rules Committee, of course, is meeting right now to deliberate the rule for consideration of the three bills. Interestingly enough, normally the Democrats don't vote for the rule, the Democrats on the Rules Committee, but it's my understanding that since this has been worked out on a bipartisan basis, something very unusual these days, of course, but to that extent that the Democrats on the Rules Committee will overcome the Freedom Caucus votes against reporting it out. Long story short, then those three bills will be debated individually, and then the rule will allow for those three bills to be bundled up into one and sent to the Senate. And I believe at that particular point, there will be more than 60 votes in the United States Senate to pass the bill. Whether that's on Sunday night or Monday morning, clearly the House and the Senate to be out next week, but I think the Majority Leader Schumer will keep them in session to pass this bill. It should have been passed a long time ago.
So we have a working weekend. Bill,
Yes.
We've been talking about this for months with your help. What do you think it is that actually got the gears turning so quickly here? It was just the beginning of this week. We were told, hey, this might not be done until June. It's just too complicated. But here we are with a president who's pulling out the pen, getting ready to sign this.
Well, I think obviously the Iran's missile attack on Israel was a issue that created the impetus to move forward quickly.
Yep.
I also think, to be honest with you, that the new speaker has kind of grown into his job and realizes that the only way in a very divided and very narrow United States House, the only way that we can get anything done and move forward on some of these critical issues is in a bipartisan way. And I think this is a real credit to his leadership, his growing into his leadership, that he has moved forward with this approach, which I find an interesting approach. It clearly does have a small piece of this. It is the same top line, $95.3 billion that was out of the Senate. But there is a small element of that 95.3, which is a loan, non-recourse loan in the end of the day. And I think that's enough to get it over the hurdle in the House and over to the Senate quickly.
Well, this is pretty remarkable. If Mike Johnson survives this, even if there is or is not a privileged motion to vacate, if he gets through this and if he gets this done, is he a made man? Does this actually get him into the woodwork in a way, create support, a galvanizing moment that he might not have had otherwise? Or are we just going to have motion to vacates every week for the rest of this Congress?
As you know, I'm a Senate staffer, former Senate staffer, not a House. I don't know. I think that the clock is clicking down here. We're moving clearly into the fall elections. I don't think most Republicans want to go through another vacate of the speakers and all that. So I think that he can get over this hurdle. He shows that he has the leadership capability, that he can negotiate and work it out. I wish that we had moved faster on it, and I think he probably does too. He's always been a supporter at the end of the day for Ukraine funding. So I think he's had to work with a very difficult caucus, obviously, the Freedom Caucus. But I think he's shown some real gumption here in terms of moving forward and standing up and saying the only thing that we can do in this very divided Congress is to have bipartisanship. And of course, coming from the Bipartisan Policy Center, I respect and admire him for finally getting to that position, that's the only way to govern in a very divided House of Representatives.
I hate pulling you into the lower chamber, Bill. I know you're better than that. But I'll ask you lastly, with the Senate in mind, they've been hemming and hawing about this TikTok divester ban bill, and apparently it's going to be on its way to the Senate here, tied to this fourth piece of legislation. Will senators have to just swallow it?
Listen, I'll be honest with you. I'm not clear that that fourth bill that includes the TikTok and imposing sanctions on Russia. I may be Eric. I missed Eric's comments, and he is great. I comment on Eric Watson. I thought it was a separate. I thought that the only three bills that would be bundled into one would be the foreign aid bills. But you may be right. I did not realize that the TikTok bill, if it passes the House, that it would be bundled with the other three. I thought it was separate and apart. But I apologize.
Well,
I don't
That's
know.
quite all right. The fact of the matter is we're not exactly sure how that's going to work here, Bill, but it sounds like the Senate has a problem with that legislation. We'll just have to see where the narrative goes from here. It's great to have you back, Bill Hoagland, at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you, sir, for being with us. A little peek behind the curtain with the help of Bill and Eric Watson that you're only going to find here on Bloomberg Radio. If you're with us on YouTube, welcome. If you're not, go there now and search Bloomberg Global News. You'll find our live stream and be able to see all of our guests and interviews here in the studio. We've saved a seat for you. Coming up, we turn to the campaign trail. The Harvard Institute of Politics is out with its latest youth poll, and it does bring reasons to worry for both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. We'll have more on that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
Okay, today I'm going to talk about how to succeed with a startup. Obviously, more than can be said here in 20 minutes, but I will do the best I can. The most important thing, the number one lesson we try to teach startups is that the degree to which you're successful approximates the degree to which you build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it. Startups always ask us for the secret to success. They always want to believe it's something other than this, because this is really hard to do. But this is it. If you can build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it, you have done 80% of the work that you need to be a really successful startup. If you think about the most successful companies you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, you probably found out about them because a friend of yours said, you got to try this, it's great. So this is the bar. something that people love so much they tell their friends about it. One important indicator for a product like that is a product that's simple to explain and easy to understand. If you can't explain in a few words what you do, and if at least some people don't say, oh, that's pretty interesting, that's usually a mistake. It's usually a sign of unclear thinking or a need that is not big enough.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly.
We're Monzo. Give us a go. See?
I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need, like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
It's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
In Pennsylvania, Philadelphia to be exact, and the entire Kennedy family is with him. Former Congressman Joe Kennedy III is going to be introducing him today. Of course, he is Joe Biden's special envoy to Northern Ireland, as we told you here on the program when we spoke a couple of weeks ago in advance of St. Patrick's Day. Today, the president having a pair of campaign events. This is the big one, though, as the administration, the campaign, I should say, tries to delineate between the Kennedys and RFK Jr. Donald Trump, meanwhile, in court today. Jury selection continues, and it has been an absolute wild series of stories that we'll talk about a little bit later on this hour. It brings me to the latest research from the Harvard Kennedy School. Remarkable. The Institute of Politics out with its latest poll of young voters. We spend so much time talking about this, specifically with regard to Joe Biden, but we're going to tackle both candidates in this case in a conversation with John Della Volpe, Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics Director of Polling. John, it's wonderful to have you on Bloomberg. I appreciate your time today, and thank you for joining us today as part of our conversation. You actually found reasons to worry for both candidates, which I'd love to hear about here. But the fact of the matter is, Donald Trump, when you look at voters 18 to 29, which I thought was the sweet spot for a Democrat, Donald Trump is actually eating into Joe Biden's lead. What did you learn?
Well, yes, Joe. I think the lesson from this survey for me is there's a significant mood shift from the beginning to the end of this survey, seismic, I think. For example, there's a real concern that young people have about the state of the nation. Only 9% say it's on the right track. President Biden's approval ratings are not what he would like them to be. Let's say it this way. There's concerns about the economy, inflation, cost of living, of course, the wars overseas. Despite that, on a two-person race between Biden and Trump, when I look at the likeliest of likely voters, we see that Joe Biden has a 19-point lead. So that 19-point lead was larger 4 years ago. So there is some degree of peeling away some of that lead. But we haven't seen what a lot of other polls have been producing. We haven't seen a wholesale shift from Democrats to Republicans or from Biden to Trump in this poll.
I just wonder if this is a conversation for you and I to have right now, and for the campaign to sweat over, knowing that young people, assuming they show up, are going to vote for Joe Biden because he is aligned in many cases with their priorities, when he's talking about forgiving student loan debt, when he's talking about bottom up, middle out, housing initiatives, and so forth. What happens in the polls in November can frequently be a disconnected exercise. What do you think?
Well, I think that's right. We need to be listening better. In the polling, as I just cited, right, his approval rating, his right track, wrong track, you could look at those numbers in a vacuum, Joe, and say, there's no way someone like that could be reelected, okay? But he is, because, as you said, it's about values. And I think as the campaign moves forward, there will be kind of a direct comparison between what life was like under Trump, what life was like under Biden, and what the future looks like. The good news in this poll, for all of us, in my opinion, is that there's been a significant shift of attitudes. Young people can see the difference that engagement makes. They're more today than they were a couple of years ago, seeing the differences between the parties, and are as likely to vote at this time as they were in 2020. And as we know, in 2020, there was record turnout among younger people. So I'm cautiously optimistic we'll see significant turnout again in November.
Well, that's remarkable and contrarian because I keep hearing that, young people are going to stay in bed or something. The cause for worry for Donald Trump here, John, as he sits in a courtroom today, this could get a lot worse if he's convicted. What did you learn about that in your research?
That's right. I've said for quite some time that for Democrats to feel good about winning this electoral college, they should be around 60% with younger people. The way that he gets there, the quickest route actually for Biden to get to 60% in our poll is if Trump gets convicted on any one of these trials. There was roughly an 8 to 10 point swing based upon that information. So that could be a game changer. This isn't just about guilty or not guilty for Trump. This is about president or not president for Trump.
51% support a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, 10% oppose. At some point between now and November, I think most people agree this conflict in Gaza will end. If Joe Biden can have his fingerprints on a ceasefire or some sort of construct going forward that would invoke peace, does that help him immediately with these voters?
Yeah, more than anything, young people want peace. They want peace and security, stability in their lives, and for those people more vulnerable than even themselves around the world. This poll clearly shows that younger people sympathize, not just with one side, but with both sides. With the sympathy lies with the Palestinian people, and sympathy also lies with the Israeli people, not necessarily with their leaders or with their governments. If Joe Biden can help architect an end to this war, create a pathway to a two-state solution, that could be one of those moments, again, Joe, right, where we're talking about going from the mid-50s to 60%, that easily could do that.
John, it's great to have you back. I'd love to stay in touch with you over the course of this campaign on your youth poll, but your other research as well. Your insights are important to us. John Della Volpe, Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics, Director of Polling. Great to see you here on Balance of Power. Want to hear some insights on the research here from Bloomberg Politics contributor Rick Davis, of course, no stranger to polling, and bringing us a slightly different view here as our Republican strategist. Rick, how do you interpret the numbers here? Because it looks like there are causes for concern on both sides.
Yeah, there's no question that in this, poll at Harvard, it shows what some of the other surveys, including the Bloomberg survey of swing states, have shown, which is, Biden underperforming his 2020 levels with young people. Professor Volpe nailed it. He needs another 10% to be able to build off of the same winning coalition that he had before. And there are ways in this survey to do that. Although I would say the sort of blinking yellow light is on intensity. And this survey and others that I've seen indicate that there is just a slightly less intense vote, especially in certain demographics. And in this case, in the Harvard poll, may actually hurt Trump. He is much more popular with those who say they're least likely to turn out to vote. But at the end of the day, Democrats are going to have their hands full to try and turn out the voters that are for Biden who might have issues with any list of many things that they were talking about. I mean, the student debt relief I thought was fascinating. There are fewer people who think of Joe Biden as being positive on debt relief, I think like 33% in this poll, and he had a higher job approval than that. So like people aren't giving him as high a positive on his job approval related to student debt as they are overall, which I was stunned by.
Only 9%, Rick, of young Americans think that our country is headed in the right direction.
Yeah,
that's
was
pretty
another
terrible, isn't it?
Standout number. Yeah, I agree. I mean, about the normal 58% in that poll indicated that they thought it was on the wrong track, but 9% is less than half of that number from the same period of time in 2020 and 2022. And so one of the things that I think is a major theme of this survey is how these young people, especially the 18 to 24-year-olds, think about their institutions of government, and it's less positive than it's ever been. And so I do think this is a more generic issue, less to do with the horse race of Biden versus Trump.
Yeah, honestly, I mentioned it for that very reason. I don't even know how that breaks. I suppose it doesn't help the incumbent. But to think that people 18 to 29 in this country think that overwhelmingly that we are going in the wrong direction really says a lot to us right now, Rick. And I wonder how much it has to do with just the noise. We talk so much today, every day on this program, about division, about chaos. Or is it their own lifestyle, their feeling of security? What do you chalk it up to?
You know, I think you got to also consider the historical perspective. I mean, think about these people. They have come to age politically, you know, with massive economic dislocation, you know, global pandemics that shut down governments and private sector for years at a time, education systems where they didn't attend their own graduations from college because of COVID. I mean, like, you think about their perspective, and they have to be wary, right? They have not gotten a particularly fair shake, you know, through their teenage years, and now they're, you know, in their voting age level, and they have a lot of skepticism. They've been disappointed time and time again, probably more so than any generation outside of the, you know, World War II generation that had to, you know, deal with a World War and a depression all at the same time. This group is not far off from that.
This is why I wanted to talk to Rick Davis about the poll. Thank you, Rick. Fascinating insights. Rick's going to be back as we assemble our panel coming up with Rick Davis, and Brad Howard from Corcoran Street Group is with us today for the balance of the broadcast. Let's get you up to date first on world and national news. For that, we turn to Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. One of the jurors seated for the hush money case against Donald Trump was excused. The woman told the judge that she was worried about her identity becoming public. Judge Juan Merchan excused her and then blocked the news media from reporting any information that might identify members of the jury. There are now 6 jurors seated, and they have to choose 6 more, plus 6 alternates. The judge has said he wants opening arguments to begin on Monday. Long-stalled aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan on track now to pass Congress as House Democrats are lined up to back Speaker Mike Johnson's plan and provide the votes to overcome a planned blockade attempt by GOP conservatives. The House is expected to hold a series of votes on Saturday. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Ukraine's foreign minister at the G7 meeting on the Italian resort island of Capri, where Russia's war with Ukraine and surging tensions in the Middle East are topping the agenda. Blinken called it a critical time for Ukraine.
It is urgent that all of the friends and supporters of Ukraine maximize their efforts to provide with Ukraine with what it needs to continue to effectively defend itself against this Russian aggression.
And the U.S. has imposed fresh sanctions on Iran over its April 13th strike on Israel, targeting 16 people and entities, including a company that helped make engines for the type of drones that were launched in that attack. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg.
Another thing that startups need to look for is a market that is either started to undergo or is soon going to undergo exponential growth. I think this is actually related to one of the biggest mistakes investors make when evaluating startups. Investors always say, well, what's your growth rate? We care about the growth rate. Investors will forgive smallish revenue today if it's growing quickly. For some reason, people don't think about markets this way. But if you think about the most important startups, they are the ones that I start in small markets that are growing very, very quickly. 11 years ago, the market for iPhone apps was $0. It's now huge. And I think if you only think about the TAM today, you'll make a big mistake. What you really want to do is identify a market that's going to grow every year and be able to ride that up elevator.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly.
We're Monzo. Give us a go. See?
I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need, like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
But it's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Ratio.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
My general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe one stage or two stages ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. What does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down the path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to build a path towards that. Almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. Think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there, and who do you need to work with, upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do 3 things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So it's strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
Business Flash Balance of Power continues now. Once again, here's your host, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. And thanks for joining us on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now. Search Bloomberg Global News. Interesting quick update here on the parliamentary wonky procedure that we obsess over sometimes on this broadcast. It's kind of important on this one. There was a question earlier in the hour about whether the 3 spending bills, Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, would in fact be bundled with the sidecar bill. We got just a little bit too much jargon in Washington. That's the one that's got TikTok, the Repo Act, sanctions against Iran. The rule is apparently written, we'll see if this passes, in a way that would combine all 4 and send them over to the Senate. So senators will have something to think about when it comes to the TikTok, the divest or ban TikTok issue as it is written at the moment. We'll keep tabs on this. We don't know if there's going to be a rule. Mike Johnson might just have to suspend the rules and have Democrats take care of this on a 2/3 majority. We're going to find out together. But I'm struck by his language once again. This is yesterday talking to reporters. Quote, the Speaker of the House, I really do believe the intel and the briefings that we've gotten. I believe Putin, and Iran really are axis of evil. I think they're in coordination on it, unquote. Did he not believe the briefings before that? Let's assemble our panel. Rick Davis is with us once again, Bloomberg Politics contributor, of course, Republican strategist, joined today by Democratic strategist Brad Howard, founder, president of the Corcoran Street Group. Great to have both of you with us. Rick, what's your thought on Mike Johnson's messaging yesterday? Because while I keep hearing that he's long been in support of Ukrainian funding, he's allowed months to go by without bringing it to the floor and has spent a lot more time talking about securing our border. That's been the refrain from the Republican conference. He's speaking now like a true believer. What do you think he wants to see happen?
Well, I think this is the chapter that you would describe as the education of Speaker Johnson. You got to remember, he was not a well-informed member prior to becoming Speaker. He's the least experienced Speaker, I think, in modern political history. And so you take a backbench, in the majority, but not, a major player by any sense, from a committee point of view. And you make him Speaker, and all of a sudden he actually does get intel that he didn't otherwise get before. He does have access to information and people who never would have taken a meeting with him, as a relatively junior member from Louisiana. So he has had an education that maybe the learning curve is so steep that it's taken him this many months just to get to the point where he can actually form an opinion. I'm not surprised that the first quarter of his tenure so far was focused on sort of just mouthing out, domestic talking points related to the border over and over and over again. And then you see in this instance that border is not even a part of this package, that even the messaging that's in some of these titles about border security is just rhetoric. It has no bearing in law itself if these things all pass, which we all anticipate they will. So this is a different man, and I think he's starting to learn what it is to be a leader of the United States of America, the most powerful nation in the world, and the role that we play in that world toward peace and security. I hope it sticks. I hope he actually is Speaker longer than, the balance of the month, because I do think this kind of education is important, and it seems to be bringing him along nicely.
Brad Howard, it's great to have you back. You were chief of staff for a lawmaker who was steeped in national security. Of course, that was Stephanie Murphy of Florida. What do you make of the evolution of Mike Johnson? He said in front of reporters, I really do believe the intel and the briefings. Is there a time when he did not?
Well, I think every rank and file member looks at the intelligence they get from leadership or from the White House with an air of skepticism, right? They're pushing a narrative, they're pushing a message. The briefings are usually around trying to get you to do something. So inherently, as a lawmaker, you want to be skeptical of the intelligence, or at least of the snapshot they're giving you, right? I think as Speaker of the House, let's keep in mind he is second in line to the presidency behind Kamala Harris. So he is given extra purview into intelligence that you normally don't get with the rank and file. And so that allows him to probably get a fuller picture and have a better understanding of where the intelligence is coming from. But I think Speaker Johnson is very smart here. And I don't know if to compliment Republican speakers, but he is starting to evoke images of Reagan. And I think of foreign policy, there's no president in the modern era who has a greater record of foreign policy and American pride than Ronald Reagan. And I think if he goes down because of doing what Reagan would have done, he still has a future in the party, and I think could come back as Speaker given a different type of majority. So he's playing his cards, I think, carefully here, but it's smart to try to link your brand to Ronald Reagan, because that Ronald Reagan is not continuing to find this modern Republican base at the moment.
Well, so is this the start of a longer-term tenure than we might have been thinking, Rick? Does Mike Johnson potentially emerge from this stronger, especially if he can beat back another motion to vacate? Could this actually be the beginning of his speakership?
It's kind of a you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. The only way he survives a motion to vacate is with Democratic votes, and that almost by definition means he won't likely be Speaker if Republicans win in November again and get to choose the next Speaker. So I think he's got a relatively short-term view to survive through the election, to get as much done like this as he can. And this is the right road, I think, to go for him. And as he said yesterday, I've got to let the chips fall. I can't plan in advance. I've got to take the actions that I believe are good for our country today and worry about what happens tomorrow tomorrow. And so I want to believe that he is maturing into the job, like almost everybody does when they become president, vice president, speaker, majority leader. These are not jobs that you get training for. You have to experience them. And so he's going through that, and there does seem to be some gravitas starting to build up behind his leadership. Question is, what happens post-November? I think he's going to find a way to survive between now and then.
You wonder if that aura does start to emerge here. Brad, Marjorie Taylor Greene's very unhappy. You know that she's already filed the motion to vacate. It's not been privileged here. You might have seen she's written an amendment that we're not sure if this will be considered for the Ukraine spending bill that would require any lawmaker who votes for the bill to conscript into the Ukrainian military. So if your member votes yes, apparently you go to the front lines in Ukraine. In all seriousness, though, she might pull the trigger on this. We don't know. She's got Tom Massey apparently ready to help her in an effort to raise the threshold on a motion to vacate. Seems to be going down in flames right now in the rulemaking process. So we're talking to Democrats like Adam Smith who say, we're not staying home. We'll actually be right there in the chamber and vote for Speaker Mike Johnson out of principle. How many Democrats are there like that?
Well, let's be clear, because I went back and looked up. I was watching your program yesterday when Adam Smith said that, and the speaker, when he said it, he would not vote to remove the speaker, right?
Okay.
So voting for the speaker is a different. I just want to clarify the difference here. He won't vote to remove him, but if there's a motion to vacate, right, and they have an election and he's removed and there's an election for speaker, that doesn't bind Adam Smith to, let's say Mike Johnson runs again because he can. That doesn't mean Adam Smith will vote for him in that situation. Let's start there. But number two is I do think there's a growing number of Democrats who are strong on foreign policy, like my boss was, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, who believe in the power and generosity of America to push back against dictatorships and communists. That's very aligned with like the neoconservative policies of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, that I think would rise up in this moment and explore the rare opportunity to, not remove Speaker Johnson from office. But again, Speaker Johnson is going to have to take some goodwill that the remainder of the Congress, he's willing to work with Democrats. Now, when you look at the rules on these national security bills individually, keep in mind, think about this stat for a second. The last time President Biden signed a law that passed by a rule in the House was May of 2023. It was the Fiscal Responsibility Act that ultimately led to McCarthy's ouster, and Leader Jeffries delivered, I think, 30 or 40 votes to help pass that rule. So there is precedent. Jeffries is willing to do it. He did it previously. He'll do it again. But there's still a lot of uncertainty, and I like a lot of skepticism of Democrats voting to keep Speaker Johnson in place.
See, it's interesting. You're hearing this play out live on the air. You ask the lawmaker, it's like, well, yeah, out of principle, I'll have it. But you talk to the staffer, you want to talk to Brad Howard, you're going to get a much more qualified and specific answer. It's exactly what he would have told his member. Now, this is fascinating to me as well. Rick Davis, a reporter at Politico, just tweets, House Freedom Caucus members are signing up to take shifts to guard the House floor in order to prevent resolutions they'd consider unsavory from slipping through that could curb their power. The Floor Action Response Team, FART, aims to guard against a voice vote or unanimous consent vote or action could be stealthily taken against them and their members. Rick, what are we about to see unfold on the floor in the next couple of days?
Yeah, look, I'd be surprised if there are any parliamentary tricks that they need to do. The reality is, and we've been talking about this for quite some time, there are plenty of votes in the House of Representatives, both Republican and Democrat, for all these provisions. And so they're not actually controversial from the point of view of an up or down vote. It's been getting to that up or down vote. And the fact, as Brad was pointing out, that you can get a rare opportunity to get a rule out on these because Democrats are going to help in the Rules Committee, then you ought to have a pretty easy trajectory to the floor. I think that there's so much performance activity going on with the Freedom Caucus and Marjorie Taylor Greene. You can't lose sight of the fact that the House is actually being pretty functional right now. So don't let the FART committee distract you from the work that's going on the floor.
What would you do about that? Brad, you had floor privileges. How would you manage that today?
Well, so first of all, I think it's smart what they're doing here, because the way this normally works is whether it's a pro forma session, which is where they gavel in order and then gavel it out really quickly to not have to officially adjourn. There is always one member of the majority there and one member of the minority there, and the minority member always objects if it's something that Republicans are trying to do. So, like, you can do anything in the House with quote without objection. Just saying that key phrase, you can literally do whatever you want. And so you need a member there to shout objection, and that forces a vote. So that's smart. But I think secondly, keep in mind there are two procedural hurdles to even get to a vote on a bill. You've got to, number one, get through the Rules Committee, which is tough because there's, the Freedom Caucus put a lot of members on there under Speaker McCarthy's negotiations for Speaker. You got to get it out of the Rules Committee. And then number two, you have to actually pass the rule on the floor. So the Democrats can help in both situations. There are different dynamics at play here, but Speaker Johnson has those two hurdles to get through before he can even bring it to the floor, unless he does it under suspension of the rules. But then you need 290 instead of 218. So that creates an additional hurdle. So it's a game of parliamentary procedure and math and House rules and processes here. And it's a fun thing to watch, but I'm glad the FARC committee is there to ensure no funny business.
Yeah, wow. It's what a way to make a living here. But where do they come up with this stuff? The Floor Action Response Team. I mean, I don't know. It's just made for broadcasting, I guess. We spent time with our panel. Rick Davis and Brad Howard have both been there. FARC committee or not, something's going to happen today. I think we can all agree here that we're going to see some bills pass. It's going to be fascinating to see the machinations between the two chambers here. We're going to talk more with the panel about that coming up. But imagine a world in which, when 1 week, 4 bills pass the United States House of Representatives. I am a little curious about the sidecar. This is, we've got the 3 spending bills, Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan. There's this other bill that they have put together, a couple of things. It's the Repo Act, sanctions against Iran, and then there's TikTok. And the Senate was kind of in a bunch about the TikTok thing. It wasn't about to pass, even though the House had already done its work on that. So we could be in a world in which senators have some pretty tough decisions to make. Rick Davis and Brad Howard, as I mentioned, back next hour. Kayleigh Lyons is on the way in. We'll have another update from Capitol Hill. Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamari will keep us honest, and we'll have a conversation with retired General Ken McKenzie coming up in hour 2 of Balance of Power. It's straight ahead on Bloomberg.
My general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe 1 stage or 2 stages ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. What does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down the path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to like build a path towards that. It's almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. Think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there, and who do you need to work with, upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do three things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So it's strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
When I was younger, I used to be in bands. I'd play drums in bands and toured America with them. Did a lot of session drumming, recorded albums. So yeah, it was good fun doing the drumming. The only reason I stopped it, well, I still play, but not as serious as I did when I was younger. But drumming doesn't pay the bills. I was never good enough to be able to pay the bills with it, but it was good fun. I started RJF, and the reason I started it was I saw a gap in the market for particular early stage and startup businesses. With the experience that I've got of running businesses, of being a finance director at the very biggest companies in the world to being finance director of small startups, we were looking at providing more than just basic accountancy services. So yes, we'll do all that. We'll do all the basic, all the statutory side of things that you need to do. But there's so much more value that we can add, and I wanted to have my experience to help these startups, because a lot of them don't really know where to go. You can go to your high street accountants and they can do a good job compliance-wise, but you would question whether they've actually been in the fire line of a business. Have you been in a business where you're thinking, how do I pay wages next week? Or business is really successful, what do we do with it next? Or how do we grow it? How do we grow into international territories? Or how do we grow our markets? How do we expand? So a lot of the experience I've seen over the years and seen different types of business in different sectors, I thought, well, it's a real value that I can add to these businesses as opposed to just being an FD, because a lot of these businesses can't afford an FD. But if we can take care of their statutory side of things, the compliance side of things, I'm on hand to be able to help and advise businesses with their growth strategy, or if they're in difficulty, help them through these times.
Up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Kelly, and happy Thursday to you both. We are looking at a stock market now that is well off session highs. In fact, NASDAQ just dipping into the red. The S&P 500 index, little change right now, up just 4 points at 5,026 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a gain right now of just about 0.1%. We've got the Dow up 65, higher by 0.2%. NASDAQ lower, down less than 0.1%. The NASDAQ 100 index, full of those big tech names, down 0.1%. Russell 2000, though, holding on to a gain of 0.5%. The 10-year right now, 4.64%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.98%. Spot gold up $27 the ounce to $23.88, up by about 1.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.5%, 83.10 right now for a barrel of WTI. The world's biggest bond market extending this month's sell-off as solid economic data this morning and hawkish Fed speak spurs bets that interest rates will be higher for longer. Micron Technology shares, they are lower now by 3%. Micron is the largest American maker of computer memory chips. It is poised to get $6.1 billion in grants from the Commerce Department to help pay for domestic factory projects. Micron, though, lower as part of a broader tech sell-off. Again, Micron down now by 3%. Netflix after the bell, again recapping S&P up 3 points now, up by about 0.1%. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington once again. Here they are, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet up in New York for us. Thank you so much. Welcome back, where we're taking you live inside the happenings in Washington. on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Certainly, Joe, it has been a doozy of the last couple of days. We've gone from not being sure whether or not Ukraine aid would ever reach the House floor to knowing that it's going to come in tandem with aid for Israel, Taiwan, and a so-called sidecar bill that will include the TikTok divestiture issue, repo, frozen Russian assets, also Iran sanctions, all of this then going to get mashed together and sent over to the Senate.
That was all off the top of her head. That's very good. I think introducing more jargon. Sidecar, come on, stop, guys. Everyone's having a hard enough time following along. With Senator Tom Tillis, who said, I don't care how the sausage is made. Some people do care how it's made. And the Republican conference in the House included, the Freedom Caucus specifically, not happy about this, and that's why it's been jammed up in the rules-making process. This is how it goes in Washington. But you want to talk about the sausage being made, we probably won't see an actual vote on the real bill until Saturday. Jonathan Tamari from Bloomberg Government joins us now after an attempt to pass a rule on the so-called sidecar. Failed last night, Jonathan. The line from the sorry, not sorry statement from Chip Roy, Republican on the Rules Committee. He said, sorry for opposing a crappy rule that is a show vote. Cover vote for funding Ukraine instead of border security. There was an attempt to fold the border into this. I don't know if that's going to survive the process here, Jonathan. We don't know if there even will be a rule. What can you tell us?
Yeah, it seems very unlikely at this moment that the border policies are going to survive or are going to be part of anything that can actually pass the House, because this is going to require Democratic votes. They're strongly opposed to what Republicans want to do on the border. And remember, in their mind, the Democrats reached out and made compromises back in February to do a deal that would include foreign aid and border security, and Speaker Johnson rejected that. They're looking for a clean foreign aid bill here with some of these sidecar provisions that you mentioned, but nothing that goes as far as the border does.
So obviously, those like Chip Roy are not all too pleased with this. It's just a question of how many are not pleased enough that they could potentially move to oust the speaker. Jonathan, Joe and I were just talking about the idea that you may have Democrats coming to save the day, but we also woke up this morning to murmurs around this idea that they may actually just change the rules so that it's no longer one individual member who can bring a motion to vacate. That seems, though, that it died a very quick death, right?
It appears to be. It's been very murky. It's been back and forth all morning, but Speaker Johnson was in a heated discussion with some of the more far-right members of his conference on the House floor this morning. They seem to think that the idea has been dropped. Some of them said that, listen, if you change the rules for the motion to vacate, it will trigger a motion to vacate. So it's almost like a, heads we win, tails you lose situation there. It does seem like that's falling by the wayside, but as you could tell from my discussions, your discussions, it's been a very fluid and fast-moving situation, and it's still evolving right now.
Well, it sure sounds like it. If we cut to the chase, though, it's sometimes so hard to cut through the noise, Jonathan, and you're very good at doing that. Our analysts on this broadcast have said that these bills, the three spending bills specifically, could attract 300 or more votes, that they will pass. I know there are concerns about the way things get stitched together in this Frankenstein strategy, but do you see that being the case? When we get to Saturday, we're going to talk about bills passing the House of Representatives.
I think so. It's sure these are issues that have support from the vast majority of Democrats and probably a significant majority of Republicans as well. It's only the process and the procedures that have allowed a small faction of Republicans to really jam up the works until now, and Speaker Johnson's own reluctance to actually go ahead and put these things on the floor. But once the Speaker decides to put it up for a vote, there is a significant majority in the House, I believe, that will support these things. They might be different coalitions. You might see some people defect on Ukraine, more Republicans defect on Ukraine, some more Democrats defect on Israel. But I think taken together, you'll see a significant majority of the House get this done by the end of the week.
All right, going to be a working weekend in all likelihood for Jonathan Tamari, who covers Congress for Bloomberg Government. Thank you so much for working hard today as well and joining us here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. And Joe, we spoke it into existence almost just by raising the question of changing the rules on the motion to vacate. Congressman Dusty Johnson, a Republican, just posted a video on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. Enough is enough. The motion to vacate is a waste of time. We need to change the rules. He says he's working with a group to change those rules on the motion to boot out a speaker. So maybe the effort isn't all too dead. It's just coming from outside the leadership ranks,
Well, and of course, that's chair of the Main Street
Yes.
Republican caucus, right? So he's going to have that establishment view that might not be shared by folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tom Massey and some others who were the instigators here. But pretty remarkable. I think that our mission today is to cut through the drama because there's a lot. We could write tabloids all day today. We could TMZ this thing for the rest of the afternoon. But there does seem to be a prize at the end of the road here come Saturday, whether you're talking about our allies in Ukraine or in Israel, Kaylee, which is why this next conversation is so important.
Yeah, against the domestic political backdrop is a very real and potentially dangerous geopolitical one, as there are hot conflicts all around the world, on the continent of Europe, and of course in the Middle East. And that is where we begin our conversation now with retired General Ken McKenzie. He is executive director of the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute, but also former U.S. Central Command Commander. General, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. You recently penned an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about how you view the attack we saw last weekend, Iran sending hundreds of drones and missiles in Israel's direction. You say that was a show of weakness. What does Israel need to do to not show weakness in return in its response that is still calibrated to not escalate this conflict any further?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on today. I believe that one of the hardest things you can do is translate an operational victory into strategic success, and that's the challenge ahead of Israel. Look, Iran is weakened in every way by this attack. They're more cut off from people in the region, more cut off internationally, and they have reason to now look at their own offensive capabilities with some concern. So they face their own set of problems. Israel's set of problems, though, is really not so much the technical military aspect of it, which worked quite well over the weekend, but rather how to maintain this alliance structure, this collective security approach that was so profitable for them. And they need to do that while still considering whether or not they're going to strike back at Iran. And I think it's the big question, how, where, and the scope of that potential attack. That's the big question that lies ahead of Israel right now. And they need to think strategically as they come to a conclusion.
Where the U.S. support comes into play, General, is what I'd love to hear you speak to. We're talking about $60 billion plus being invested in hardware for Ukraine. We know that Ukraine has ammunition shortages. We know that every shell at this point matters. Israel's in a very different situation. What does it need that this $14 billion can buy?
Well, I think the main thing Israel's going to need is continued supply of interceptors, all the systems, the defensive systems that we saw employed over the weekend. Because I'll tell you, we fired a lot of air-to-air missiles shooting down those drones.
Yeah, we did.
And we and our partners fired a lot of surface-to-air missiles and anti-ballistic missiles, bringing down those other platforms that were inbound. So they're going to need constant replenishment of that. You know, the good side of the weekend's attack is we successfully defended Israel. The bad side is, frankly, you're on the wrong side of the cost imposition curve. It's easier to build the drones, missiles, and land attack cruise missiles cheaper, I should say, than it is to build the systems that are Israel. So you're on the wrong side of that, but we're going to need to continue it into the future, I think.
Well, okay, so you're saying basically that what all Iran needs to do is do the cheaper thing, whereas it's much more costly for Israel to do what they need to do defensively. So I guess it raises the wider question, General, of how we may need to rethink what it is that deters Iran. Is Iran likely to change its behavior as a result of this attack that, sure, they called successful, but as we know, largely was not, as most of this incoming missile and drone to Israel was intercepted, as you've been talking about. So is Iran likely to be more dangerous now or less dangerous now, I guess, is the question. And then how do you deter that level of danger?
Sure. So let me back up a step and say, why did Iran launch this attack? They launched this attack because over the past many months, they've been consistently outfought by Israel in this shadow war, this dialogue of targets that's gone on, culminating in the 1 April attack on Iranian leaders in Damascus. So I think what Iran felt, they were in a corner, they were on the wrong side of this equation. And so what they try to do is take a page out of the Russian playbook, what we call escalate to de-escalate. Do something profoundly aggressive that makes your opponents rock back on their heels and realize that maybe the game getting too rich for them. Here's the problem, though. Russia uses this because Russia has vast resources, including nuclear capabilities. Iran tried it, but their attempt was found to be hollow. It was unsuccessful. So Iran is in a markedly weaker strategic position today than they were last week because at the bottom line, the most important priority for Iran is preservation of the theocratic regime that runs the country. And they have viewed their ballistic missiles, drones, and land attack cruise missiles as the principal thing that deters others from attacking them. So that capability now been tested and it has failed. So Iran's in a very difficult position, even as Israel faces difficult choices. The harder choices are Iran's because something they viewed as very powerful has been exposed.
General, we'd like to ask you about a couple of things beyond Israel, including your time as commander of U.S. Central Command, in which you helped to oversee the withdrawal from Afghanistan. You testified recently on Capitol Hill about this. I would love for our viewers and listeners to get a sense of what you said, and we'll have you respond on the other side. Let's go back to that hearing on Capitol Hill. Here's the General.
Having a plan is one thing, preparing the plan, vetting the plan, coordinating the plan with the people that are going to actually carry you out, the Department of Defense, that's another set of tasks completely.
And that was too little, too late.
It is my judgment that it was far too little, far too late.
Speaking with Chairman McCall there just a couple of weeks ago on Capitol Hill. General, I'm bringing this up because this is going to be an issue on the campaign trail, something that we're covering very closely here as we enter the general election cycle. And I wonder if you agree that Joe Biden should be judged by this.
Well, the president's the commander-in-chief. He makes ultimate decisions for the military of the United States. He made the ultimate decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, and that decision was executed by us. I believe that part of the decision called for trying to keep an embassy platform in Kabul after we had withdrawn our military forces. And we also chose not to bring out our citizens and at-risk Afghans as we pulled our military forces out. So you get to the middle of August, we predicted the government of Afghanistan's falling. You've got the embassy at risk, you've got our citizens at risk, and you've got these tens of thousands of Afghans that you want to bring out. Unfortunately, you're not positioned to do that. So you have to react, you have to go back in, establish a very tenuous but ultimately effective defense of Hamid Karzai International Airfield and get people out. And that was a difficult, dangerous operation, and it involved a large element of tragedy. 13 brave Americans died trying to conduct that operation, and that weighs very heavily on me, and it will weigh heavily on me for the rest of my life.
Well, I understand that, General, and I appreciate your sharing that. Did you give the president advice that he did not take?
So, as you know, we prefer not to actually talk directly about that. I think my opinion at the time was leaving completely was a mistake, and I've been pretty open about that ever since. My views were heard. A president made a decision, and he is actually the decision maker. He gets to make that call. And my opinion then and my opinion now remains the same. We would have been wiser to keep a small residual force in Afghanistan, and I stand by that today.
General, we just have a minute left with you, but Mitch McConnell said on the Senate floor today that the political reality is if you think the fall of Afghanistan was bad, the fall of a European capital city like Kyiv to Russian troops will be unimaginably worse. And I wonder if you agree with that characterization, sir, given what you've already seen.
Well, my position would be that I think the fall of Kyiv would be disastrous for NATO. It would be disastrous for our credibility and the credibility of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it would probably prompt further aggressive moves from Vladimir Putin.
General, we thank you for the time. We would love to have you back. Retired General Ken McKenzie, retired four-star, also former commander, U.S. Central Command. We also want to note his forthcoming book, The Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century. Congratulations on the book, General. Come and talk to us again on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. We'll assemble our panel next. Rick Davis, Brad Howard are with us on the Thursday edition of Balance of Power, with much more to follow on the radio, on the satellite, and on TV. This is Bloomberg.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks now in the red across the board. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all declining right now. Just about the lows of the day on the S&P, down now by 11 points to 5,010. For the S&P, a drop right now of 0.2%. The Dow in the red as well, down 25, drop there of 0.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index is trading lower by 56 points for NASDAQ, a decline right now of 0.4%. Interestingly, though, the Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares is holding on to a gain now of 0.2%. 10-year at 4.64% with a 2-year 4.97%. Gold is up $24 the ounce. Spot gold now at $23.85, up by 1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude is advancing 0.4%, 83.04. Bottom line, red on the screen as the U.S. stock market gives up this morning's gains. Alphabet's Google has fired 28 employees after they were involved in protests against Project Nimbus, which is a $1.2 billion joint contract with Amazon to provide the Israeli government and military with AI and cloud services. The protests, which were led by the No Tech for Apartheid organization, took place Tuesday across Google offices in New York City, Seattle, and Sunnyvale, California. Alphabet shares, they're up now by 0.4%. Again, recapping, red on the screen with the S&P lower by 11 right now. That is a drop of 0.2%. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie Pellet up in New York. I'm Kaylee Lines in Washington. Joe Matthew also in Washington as we broadcast to you live on Bloomberg Television and Radio. And Joe, guess who's still not in Washington? The President of the United States remains in Pennsylvania, very key swing state. His home state, or one of them, if you will, the state of his birth. And today he's in Philadelphia, and it's not just him. There's a lot of members of the Kennedy family who will be joining him.
Like the whole family, with the exception of one. Joe Kennedy, the former Congressman Joe Kennedy III, is going to be introducing him today. That, as we actually saw here on the program a couple of weeks ago, is the president's special envoy to Northern Ireland. Then his dad, the former congressman, other family members, they're going to be there to make a point, not just that Joe Biden is their choice for president, but they are not going with RFK Jr., knowing that there is a lot of name confusion out there.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of conversations here on Balance of Power about the idea of this potential third-party threat in RFK Jr. that both Biden and Trump are facing. He could potentially pull votes for either, given the way that he is polling now. But what we hear a lot is voters don't actually know him that well. They just recognize his name. And perhaps that's a distinction that the Biden campaign is looking to.
Maybe you saw an ad in the Super Bowl, and that's kind of the extent of your knowledge. The panel knows a bit about this because we've talked about this phenomenon before and wondering to what extent this might help the president today. Rick Davis is with us, Republican strategist, Bloomberg Politics contributor, along with Democratic strategist Brad Howard, founder and president of the Corcoran Street Group. Brad, as a Democrat, do you worry about votes being lost to RFK Jr. By Democrats who have good memories of the old days?
As a Democrat, I worry about everything, Joe. We just get our own shadow, especially when things are as dicey as they are right now in the political and world stage. So yes. I mean, I think we are, and I think you see the White House and the Biden administration taking it very seriously with that massive photo of the Kennedy family. Reminding folks that even Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s own brothers and sisters are endorsing Joe Biden over Robert Kennedy. And so I think they're trying to get the message across that if you're looking for a Kennedy nostalgia, this is not the way to go.
Well, Rick, I just wonder if it's as much a question of Joe Biden having policy differences with RFK Jr., or just that the voters who are thinking they might support RFK Jr. just don't want Joe Biden and they don't want Trump, and it doesn't actually matter that the third choice is RFK Jr., it's just the third choice.
Yeah, I haven't seen very much polling about how people feel about RFK Jr.'s platform, nor do I believe that there's been much of a campaign to actually educate voters. So I doubt if it's on policy. Look, suffice it to say, we've been talking for a long time about how many Democrats are unhappy with Joe Biden. You have almost a majority of them saying he's too old to serve again. You have a lot of them who have issues with him on policy. He is not getting the share of Democrats that he needs to get reelected. And so he has to consolidate his base. Some of that base is sitting on on Kennedy. This is an effort to try and get that base to return. Come home, Democrats. You're not supposed to be sitting on Robert Kennedy's ballot. And I think there actually has been progress made. Kennedy's numbers have been coming down in these national polls, which is really the only thing we have to compare them to. And if anything, I would say Stein and West are bigger threats to Biden because those are voters who otherwise would be Biden's who are actually choosing to be on Stein and West ballot for good reasons, right? For their own reasons. So I do think political jujitsu could happen here where the Democrats come home and the only people who are supporting Kennedy are Trump supporters who Trump is out there saying nice things about Kennedy all day long. And if I were the Trump campaign, I'd shut up and quit giving the guy his props.
Wow, fascinating. Brad, what do you think about the actual content Joe Biden's talking about? Tariffs against China on this swing through Pennsylvania. He's yesterday meeting with steel workers, and this whole economic populism thing of Biden versus Trump is getting to be really something. Who wins that battle when the economy seems to be weighing on Joe Biden in the polls?
Yeah, I mean, I'll back up to something Rick said. I'd just be careful. Robert F. Kennedy's not taking votes away from the Democratic base, right? The reason why you see Joe Biden's numbers a little lower is the base our base takes forever to consolidate, from black voters to young voters to all down the line, and it takes them a while to come home, and they usually do right around convention time because by nature of being a Democrat or a progressive, they're always concerned that we're not being progressive or bold enough. That's where the disappointment comes from. Where he's pulling votes away is from people who don't really vote that often or who are on the more moderate end of the spectrum. But the more Robert Kennedy talks about his positions, the more Democrats are running away from him. So, there's that. On the economic populism stuff, look, Pennsylvania's the place to do it, right? Pennsylvania's a very blue-collar state. Look at John Fetterman's politics, who's a populist, a common guy. He was able to win with that message. And this is the president's home state. It's where he was born. And he's a union guy. Like, he's the most pro-union president we've ever had in the White House. So why not play to those strengths and try to steal back some of those populist voters who voted for Donald Trump and who thought Hillary Clinton was out of touch? I ran a campaign in Indiana where we had steel workers and everything. And I remember hearing how folks were talking about the Hillary Clinton campaign, and I was messaging back saying, I think we have a problem here with blue-collar workers. They're liking what Donald Trump is saying, and of course, the rest is history. So, I'd have a disagreement about his politics here. I'm more of a free trader, but, it's if you're going to do it anywhere, do it in Pennsylvania.
Well, Brad, you just mentioned kind of the Democratic coalition and how they take a long time to come home, and part of that being young voters. We obviously got the Harvard Youth poll out today. The results are pretty interesting when you dig into them. So anyone under 30 that can vote, 18 to 29, Biden is leading Trump by 8 percentage points, but among likely voters, he's leading by 19 points. It's a lot more women, though, than men. That is where his lead is the widest. Among young women, his lead is 33 points. Brad, I'm sure you've had a chance to look at this data. How do you read this, and what does it make you think about the problem that Biden may or may not have with these young voters?
Here's the thing about young voters. I do a lot of work with them. Young voters do not vote for people. Young voters typically vote on policy, right? They're motivated by choice. They're motivated by climate change. They're motivated by gun safety. They're motivated by the situation in the Middle East. Without a strong unifying figure like we had under Barack Obama, they just look at the issues. And a lot of young people generally care deeply about a smaller number of issues, and very passionately about one or two, and that tends to guide their politics. So a lot of young people, particularly young women, are incredibly fired up with the issue of abortion. And of course, it doesn't really matter who the D or the R candidate is. They're going to go with the pro-choice candidate there. Same thing on gun safety and climate change. And the same thing with the pro-Palestinian effort in the Democratic base. Like, they're looking for someone to listen and take their side. And at the end of the day, they have to decide between Biden or stay home. And I think at the end of the day, they'll realize just how much of a danger Donald Trump is to, Palestinians here in the U.S., Muslim Americans in the U.S., and will come home to Joe Biden. They're going to make their frustration with the president clear until Election Day.
One of the stats in this poll we talked about a little bit earlier, Brad, is something that I know Rick Davis has feelings about. Only 9% of young Americans say the country is headed in the right direction. That's remarkable. Rick, we talked about how sad that is on its face, but doesn't that weigh against the incumbent, the office holder?
Yeah, I mean, look at how things flip, right? When Trump was president, Republicans all thought the country was on the right track. Day after the election, Biden becomes president. Well, it took a little while longer than that, we all know. But all of a sudden that flips, and all those Republicans, became negative about the country's prospects, right? And so it's a very partisan thing. And so you're right to look in it as a, another sort of job performance issue. And the fact that it's that low does not bode well for the Biden image with young voters, especially because in 22, I believe it was more like 19% and closer to 25% when Biden got elected in 20. So it's not a healthy number. They've got to talk about the progress that they've made. And again, these are national numbers. It's going to be different in state by state. And I'll be particularly interested in the next Bloomberg swing state poll to see how those same, 18 to 29-year-olds are looking, vis-a-vis each state.
All right, Rick Davis, that's called a deep tease.
That's right.
Next week.
It is next week. I was going to say.
The next poll comes out.
Can't wait.
Make sure you come back and tune in to Balance of Power TV and radio for full coverage of the Bloomberg Morning Consult Swing State Poll. Rick Davis, our Republican strategist, and Brad Howard, our Democratic strategist today. Thank you both so much for joining us. And as we discussed the youth vote, Joe, it was also interesting to see in Harvard's polling that if in any one of his criminal trials, former President Trump is found guilty, it would significantly impact the youth vote. They would be more likely to vote for Biden. And of course, one of those trials as we speak is underway, though technically they're on a lunch break right now, but it is a trial day for Trump.
The stories coming out of the courtroom in this jury selection process would be enough for a book or maybe a movie all on their own. We'll talk about that coming up next.
Yep.
But you're right. And this is why we have to watch this, or one reason, so closely, a precipitous decline in support by young people if, in fact, he is convicted. And they'll find that out in the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah, indeed. We'll get the latest on the trial from our very own June Grasso of Bloomberg Law coming up in just a few moments. First, though, we got to get a check on world and national news with Amy Morrison in our 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Kaylee. Let's give you a sneak peek on what's going on in the courtroom. 2 jurors now in former President Trump's hush money trial have been dismissed. One was concerned that her identity would be revealed. The other over concerns that his answers in court weren't accurate. A new batch of potential jurors was brought in, but when the judge asked them if they cannot be fair and impartial, 48 people, about half of them raised their hands. They were all dismissed. The judge still aims to start opening arguments on Monday. The U.S. and Israel are holding a virtual meeting about a possible Israeli operation in Rafah. Sources telling Axios that the Biden administration is still worried that an Israeli invasion of Rafah would lead to massive civilian casualties. Now, that meeting is happening today, the second in recent weeks. An in-person meeting scheduled for earlier this week was postponed because of the Iranian attack. The U.S. is also hitting Iran with new sanctions, targeting Iranian leaders and entities connected to the missile and drone program in response to that attack on Israel. Long-stalled aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan on track to pass Congress. House Democrats are lining up to back it. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, the NASDAQ 100 index, all declining right now. Stocks are lower as hawkish Fed speak reinforces speculation that interest rates may be higher for longer. The S&P right now down 11 at 5,010. A drop today of 0.2%. We got Dow Industrials down 35 now, lower by just about 0.1%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is down 58 points. For NASDAQ, a drop right now of 0.4%. 10-year at 4.64% with a 2-year yielding 4.98%. Gold up $23 the ounce to $23.84 now. That's a gain of 1%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 0.3%, 82.88 for a barrel of WTI. Brevin Howard Asset Management is cutting 10% of its workforce, just about 100 employees, to reduce costs as one of the world's best-known hedge fund giants streamlines its rapidly growing operation. Sales of previously owned homes in the U.S. fell in March from a one-year high, underscoring the lingering impact of high mortgage rates and elevated prices. Among publicly traded brokers, shares of Zillow are down by 0.7%. Open Door Technologies up 2.3%, and Compass is trading lower by 1.6%. Recapping red on the screen right now. Stocks lower, S&P down 15, a drop now of 0.3%. Balance of Power continues. The Thursday edition. Back we go to Washington, and once again your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie, thank you. Certainly there is a lot of action here in Washington where Joe and I are, but there's a lot of action happening up where you are in New York as well, Charlie Pellet, including in Lower Manhattan, where it is day 3 of Trump's criminal hush money trial. Of course, it doesn't happen on Wednesdays. They're back today. We ended Tuesday with 7 jurors. We need 18 total, 12 jurors, 6 alternates.
Yep.
Today, as they're on their lunch break, we're back down to 5 because 2 jurors have now been dismissed, Joe. It seems that forward progress is starting to become backwards
Interesting.
progress.
At least one of them thought they'd been identified.
Yeah.
Do we know
media reports
why the other one has left us?
He had also expressed concern about that. He expressed annoyance about how much information was out there about him, which kind of speaks to the difficulty. This is obviously probably as high profile as a case can get. We're talking about a former president and Republican presumptive nominee here. And while the jury is going to remain anonymous, just associated with numbers, if there's identifying factors out there about them, perhaps that is a concern for their safety. And of course, it's safety concerns that led to the gag order that has been put in place that Trump is under by the judge, not just for the jury, but others affiliated with this case.
Well, we want to check in with June Grasso as forewarned. This is like a daily feast for June Grasso on her program, Bloomberg Law, and she helps us understand what's happening as well here. June, great to see you. Welcome back. We were talking about the potential of, Monday being a key day to get proceedings underway, to actually have a real opening of this trial. Does this confusion with jury selection back things up?
It definitely backs things up because they lost 2 jurors. And it also tells you about not only the high-profile nature of it, and that some jurors, after they're selected, are saying, wait a second, I don't think I want to get into this. I've been getting calls from friends and relatives, but also everyone's going home, and I mean the lawyers on the defense and the prosecution, and doing more homework on the jurors. So as to juror number 4, the man who was dismissed today, the prosecution found that in the 90s he'd been arrested for taking down conservative literature or whatever, and his wife had a deferred prosecution agreement. Now, every jury questionnaire, if you've been called before a jury, you know that it asks you whether or not you or anyone you know have been convicted of a crime, and that is number 19 on the list. And so the prosecution brought that up to the judge today. There was they talked about it at the bench, and then he was obviously, for those reasons, refused from the jury. And remember I told you about stealth jurors? So I'm wondering if he was a stealth juror who wanted to get on the jury because he said he found Donald Trump fascinating. That, when he walks into a room, everybody has some kind of a reaction to him, positive or negative. So I'm just wondering if he was one of those jurors who wanted to be on the trial.
It's interesting, and it's good that you remind us of what exactly the jurors need to be, what information that they need to be sharing that may be true across all cases, while certainly there's information that they've been asked to share that's unique to this case in terms of whether they have a true social account or have attended Trump rallies in the past, that kind of thing. But June, what about this idea of real concern over their safety? We know the judge, out of concern for the safety of court officials, of prosecutors, of him and his own family, have put Trump under this gag order, which prosecutors allege he is violated. There's going to be a hearing around it next Tuesday, but it just kind of speaks to how hard it is to keep everyone associated with this safe in real life.
And in New York, you can't have a truly anonymous jury like you did in federal court in the E. Jean Carroll case, for example. So the defense and the prosecution know the names of the jurors, although they're being identified by numbers in the courtroom. So it's not as much protection as you get in a federal case, and there's going to be a lot of attention on them. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Look what happened on the second day when a juror who'd been dismissed. So she's in the jury about a couple of hours, and she's on like several cable news networks talking about what it's like to be a juror. So there is going to be a ton of media attention. The judge asked today, or he mentioned that that the media should try to conceal the identities as much as possible. All that I saw about juror number 2 really was that she was on the young side and an oncology nurse. So I didn't see any other information about her out there, but maybe that was enough to cause her concern. I think the funny
it's
thing
interesting, June, because Jesse Waters on Fox News went up with her neighborhood, her occupation, her education, marital and family status, and what industry her fiance works in, saying, I'm not so sure about juror number 2, and that's how we get into situations like this.
I don't watch
the
Fox.
judge now asking reporters to behave. Can he enforce that, or is that advice?
That's advice. I mean, he can't tell the media what to publish or not to publish unless he wants to put a gag order on, all the media. That would be a First Amendment problem. So he's not going to do that. I didn't realize, because I was watching other cable news networks and our reporting, and, none of those details were there. So, but you see that's really dangerous because, we've seen the kind of emotions that Donald Trump brings out in his followers. And so, that I can see why the juror was distressed then, and I don't know if there have been any more information on the other jurors. What's sort of interesting to me on this jury is that there are 2 lawyers on the jury, and one's a civil litigator. And the whole thing is that lawyers usually don't want other lawyers on the jury, because in the jury room, the other jurors might turn to them at some point and say, well, what do you think about the law? Or they become the expert, on the case. So that's really unusual. We'll have to see what else happens, and if people start, really observing the jurors' anonymity or not. But that's very dangerous. You're right. It's just, and I don't know how the judge can control that. And he's tried as much as possible. Maybe they'll have to have some kind of secretive nature of the jury pool. I mean, who knows? It's hard to say.
Yeah, certainly. The judge is trying a lot of things, including trying to do this in an expeditious manner, and perhaps that's not happening to the same extent today, given that we're going backwards and we're back down to 5 jurors. And who knows how much longer this process will go on. June Grasso, final thought?
I think they've said that Monday, because of the Jewish holiday and the observance, that Monday isn't even a possibility anymore, but that's still up in the air.
Oh, okay. Good to know.
All right, and of course, Tuesday is when he's planning on hearing the arguments in the gag order violation. The prosecutors wanting to hold Trump in contempt of court, fine him $1,000 for each of the 3 instances in which they said he violated that.
So that's Tuesday.
That's
Supreme Court's
Tuesday.
Thursday.
Yes. Supreme Court, unrelated case, Jack Smith case here in Washington, question of presidential immunity, certainly a big deal. And of course, Judge Merchan in New York said Trump cannot be in attendance at the Supreme Court because as a criminal defendant in the state of New York, he has to be in that courtroom with him and everybody else. And that just speaks to how many different legal issues we are talking about here, Joe.
Next week's going to be interesting.
Yes.
We could be actually talking about the president signing a spending bill as well on Ukraine and Israel. Stay tuned on all of that. One thing we discussed yesterday, and it's still resonating here in Washington today, were these dual hearings into safety at Boeing. with a prominent whistleblower talking about missing bolts. Kaylee, looking beyond the 737 MAX 9 that's been at issue to invoke the 787 Dreamliner, saying that the way that they're assembling the fuselages could cause this thing to break apart in the air over time. Some truly scary stuff coming out of these hearings, and a lot of questions now about what they might lead to.
Absolutely, especially questions for people like myself who might be uneasy flyers and a little nervous about airplanes pretty much every time you get on one. And so it's good that we're digging a little bit more into this issue on the Bloomberg DC Big Take podcast, Big Take DC podcast. It's coming out today, and they're looking specifically at this issue. Our host of that podcast, Saleha Mohsen, Bloomberg senior Washington correspondent, is joining us now with more. So, Saleha, you actually talked to someone who would probably I would like to speak with to understand more about airplanes.
I don't want to hear about any of this stuff.
I am on them. But you literally talked to an aviation safety expert. What did he tell you specifically about these concerns with Boeing?
Kaylee, I spoke to Captain John Cox, who has 35 years of experience flying and being a safety expert after his flying career. He flew Boeing 737 jets in the peak when it was considered the beloved plane of the airline industry and of plane making. And have a listen to what he told me, and then I'm going to give you a really interesting fact for next time you board a plane, Kaylee. Here's the Captain John Cox.
I think shocked would be a better word. It was very disappointing to me as we began to understand the contributing factors for the MAX accidents, of how the culture at Boeing had changed from when I was working very closely with them in the 80s and 90s. The focus really shifted from building the highest quality airplane that they could to shareholder value.
Captain John Cox did say that he was surprised to see how high Boeing had been with these 737 jets and how low they have come. But he gave me a really interesting piece of information. He said 2023 actually was the safest in aviation history. 35 million flights took off and were all safe. Not one massive snafu.
And think of how many of those were on 737s. It's really something to consider when we all jump in our car and go careening down the highway on a daily basis. Maybe I'll just speak for myself on this one. But we should be clear, Boeing is denying the whistleblower accounts here, right? They say that they've continued to test their airframes and that they've not seen the degradation that the whistleblowers are talking about. Is anyone listening to Boeing?
Absolutely. Everyone's listening. Investors are very curious. Investigators like Captain John Cox are very curious to get to the bottom of what Boeing's side of the story is and what the whistleblowers are saying, because what they've noticed and what they've identified is that Boeing is being accused of having a culture where employees raise the alarm and say that we are picking profitability over safety, and here are all the spots in the manufacturing process where this is happening and it's being ignored. And Boeing has said this is not accurate. Now, their CEO, Dave Calhoun, did give a tearful speech to employees where he said, look, we need to take safety first, make it the first priority. I'm curious to see, we had lawmakers yesterday in double hearings, Senator Richard Blumenthal, Tammy Duckworth. They were really, really concerned about whether the American public is going to be scared to go into the skies. Next, we've got what Wall Street is waiting to hear on first quarter earnings and what it means for their debt, because they've spent $4.5 billion maybe on extra cash expenditures since the January 5th door incident.
Well, it also raises the questions, Leah, of how much of this is really Boeing's burden to bear in terms of its own safety culture versus the fact that there are certain safety standards that, as a maker of airplanes, that the FAA has in place. Certainly there's airlines who have to conduct their maintenance on these aircraft, so there's many players within this, right? And I wonder how that factors into the response we're likely to see on the regulatory side or on the legislative side.
Yeah, that's spot on. The Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, has also been called to task by lawmakers and the American public, quite frankly, and investors who are wondering, why isn't our investment safe? Why aren't our families safe when they're flying. One interesting thing is that now when you book your next vacation or your next flight, you can actually search what the plane is and opt out of Boeing. And now this is something
That's incredible.
that the government does not want happening.
A lot
the
of people
FAA
are
does not want
shopping for
happening.
Airbus right now, aren't they? Just lastly, though, we also have to acknowledge, we've talked about this a bit since the door blowout. Spirit Aerosystems, other companies that were once part of Boeing that are now part of this sort of extended manufacturing chain could also play a role in this, and that's why Boeing is trying to buy it back, right?
Absolutely. People often blame Boeing for every single plane problem, but a lot of it has to do with the carrier or these other suppliers across the supply chain.
Yeah, which is why Dave Calhoun was kind of interesting how quickly he came out to take the blame and apologize for this as a company, as Boeing, not as a partner.
Yeah, well, we'll see if Calhoun himself testifies. Certainly lawmakers
That's
have indicated
true.
they
He's
do
been no
want to hear
stranger
from him
to
before he's
Washington.
out as CEO.
That's absolutely right. So, Leah, great to see you. Big Take DC, Apple, Spotify. You know the drill. It drops today. And that's why we talk to Saleha each week at this time. We also, each day at this time, go to New York because it's time for Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Master, Tim Stenovic standing by. Carol, what do you have coming up?
We got a lot coming up. I got to say, I'm going to kind of out of the gate say Netflix is on our mind because they are reporting after the close. And Tim, that's a big one when it comes to market momentum.
Yeah, we're going to be watching that one closely. Also, we're going to be talking about real estate because it turns out that rents, well, it's really sticky when it comes to that last mile of inflation. It's kind of driving the Fed a little crazy
A little bit of a stumbling block.
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
You guys don't share your passwords anymore, right? They stopped all that? Netflix?
Listen.
Well,
I got.
You can answer
Tim
off here.
has a
I had to
brother.
make my own account.
Did
My
you?
brother
I got kicked off.
has to have his own account.
Kaylee got kicked off the family plan.
I did.
Bloomberg Business Week starts right now.
Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on TV, radio, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. Yes, indeed, this is Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenivek. And let's get to the setup on this Thursday, April 18th. And we've got yields once again edging a little bit higher after some solid economic data. I feel like we've seen this movie before.
Yeah, just more evidence, I think, for those folks who say that the Fed could be holding off on any rate cuts for the remainder of the year. With that in mind, Carol, we've got the Fed's biggest stumbling block when it comes to taming inflation, none other than rents. So what does it mean for the housing market? We'll be joined by Kate Kaminsky, COO of Walton Global, who's going to share her thoughts.
Yeah, they buy land, right? And they work a lot with developers, so she's got a really great vantage point. Also, Blackstone President and COO Jonathan Gray on the company's narrow profit beat. The stock, though, Blackstone shares a little bit lower in today's session.
And let's take a look at chip stocks today because they're down following TSMC results. The stock's now officially in a correction. We're going to take a big look at the group.
Yep, and speaking of being lower, Netflix shares trending a little bit lower ahead of its earnings. It's a big one after the close. We're going to be breaking it down, but we're going to give you kind of the goalposts to keep an eye on when they do report after the closing bell.
All that and more over the next hour. First up, though, a check of the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Hey, thank you very much. And here's what's going on. Stocks lower across the board, giving up earlier gains from this morning. Right now, right to the numbers. S&P at 5,010. Keeping an eye on that all-important 5,000. Big round number. We've got the S&P down 11 now, a drop of 0.2%. Dow Jones Industrial Average down 25 points, a drop there of just about 0.1%. NASDAQ lower now by 0.4%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 64 points. We've got hawkish Fed speak reinforcing speculation that interest rates could be higher for longer. The 10-year 4.64% with a 2-year 4.98%. Spot gold up 1%, 23.83 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude is up 0.2%, 82.82 for a barrel of WTI. Blackstone collected more fees from big retail funds and credit strategies during the first quarter, compensating for the slower pace of exit deals. Blackstone shares, they're trading lower by 2.9%. And as Carol and Tim mentioned, we've got Netflix after the bell. We'll be all over those numbers as they break. Right now, Netflix down by 1%. Recapping, stocks lower, S&P right now down by 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. So the overall equity trade, it is lower on this Thursday. So too, though, is the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index. It has dropped more than 10%, folks, since March 7th. So an official technical correction, if you will, and that has caught our attention.
Meantime, a giant in the space just selling off. Shares of TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, down about 4.5% right now. This as it scaled back its outlook for a chip market expansion, Carol, cautioning that the smartphone and PC markets still remain weak.
Yeah, I feel like we're all on notice. All right, let's get more on the group. Let's bring in Bloomberg News Managing Editor of Technology and Global Security. She's Lynn Dewan, and she joins us here in studio. All right, Lynn, let's start with TSMC. Investors definitely not happy with the results. It's the world's largest maker of advanced chips, cutting its expectations for 2024 market growth. It sounds like bad news. How do you read it? What does it really mean?
Yeah, I mean, it does put us on notice, right? We're just starting to see the chips companies report. You got Intel next week, possibly Texas Instruments too. And so this is like a potential sign of what's to come in the coming weeks. It's a nuanced picture, though, right? The outlook was bad. It was definitively bad. They were talking about weakness in the PC market, weakness in the smartphone market, but that really outshadowed a very good beat on revenue outlook, on like potential sales, on the fact that AI has growth. And so like the three of us have been talking about how nuanced the chips recovery and the chips boom from AI has been for a few quarters now. I would say this is like the most nuanced that I've seen it.
But investors are beating it up. So
that's right.
Do they have it right, or do they not have it necessarily right because you say it's nuanced?
It depends on how you feel about AI and whether AI can make up for this ongoing slump in the PC market and in the personal and in the phone market, right?
Yeah.
Like, can AI be enough to save these giant chip companies like Intel and TSMC, like that remains to be seen. But it does make you question, how you will see the fortunes of NVIDIA diverge from like TSMC and the others that make, the chips that go into cars and phones and PCs.
And NVIDIA is up about 0.6% today.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, more on NVIDIA in just a minute, but first I want to talk a little bit about ASML, because I'm wondering if perhaps some investors might have seen this coming after ASML's results yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, they're both very nuanced pictures, and that's exactly why we brought ASML up in that TSMC story, because this is now the second company that has said, whoa, like we're seeing a bit slower of a market than we thought we were, but is also giving a great outlook. So in ASML's case, there was something like a more than 60% drop in their orders. And that is bearish definitively. And yet most of the story and the narrative around its earnings was like, but don't worry, that's just temporary. AI is going to lift us back up. Demand in all these other chips markets is going to lift us back up. I think it's like a short-term versus long-term picture, right? There's a lull in the short term. People are still drawing down inventory. In ASML's case, they make the chip machinery that makes the chips, right? So they're even further upstream. And when you think about the chip plants that are being built in the US and Germany and across Asia, those have a long lead time. So what they're banking on is that, yes, while we're working through inventory now, there will be a boom in the coming years as construction gets away.
Well, as long as there's demand on the other side, ultimately the end users, right? Because, I mean, it's great. Like, let's go to the money that's being put in. We have Bloomberg News reporting exclusively about Micron Technology. That they're, right, $6 billion. Intel, Taiwan Semi have already, right, or they also are going to accept some loans as part of all of this awards packaging that's coming out. Can we assume you can do a lot of investments? If they build them, will the demand come? Can we assume that demand's going to be there ultimately, or it depends where we are?
That's hard to say, and there has been this narrative around the fact that like the market is underestimating how much data center demand there is actually going to be in AI. We had an executive at a Bloomberg Intelligence AI Summit not too long ago, just a few weeks ago, come up, and he's like at one of the hottest AI data center startups, and he was like, a year ago, we were talking about investments in the billions, and now we're talking tens of billions. Next year, we may be talking exponentially more than that, because that is what AI demand in data centers looks like. But, the TSMC story pointed out that we had today that some analysts are like pouring cold water on that idea and are wondering whether the forecasts will hold up and whether they may actually disappoint. That's a big question mark. It depends on how long the AI hype lasts.
Okay, so that, I was going to say, brings us to NVIDIA.
Yeah, go.
Okay, because that company not reporting earnings till next month, the 22nd of next month.
They're always last.
They are, but it gives us lots of time to talk about them ahead of earnings. Shares are down from all-time highs of $974 just a little bit ago, trading now at $844. In recent weeks, we've seen some companies come out with their own chips to try to compete with NVIDIA. Meta comes to mind, Intel comes to mind. Do these things hold a candle to what NVIDIA can do?
I think NVIDIA is still seen as the leader in the pack, but you have seen these other upstarts challenge them. You have seen some established chip makers. We had one in the office not too long ago that is, coming out with its own chip and its own chip design. I think, the challenge for NVIDIA now and going forward is how do you maintain that first mover advantage and keep it? It's honestly the same challenge that ASML is facing. How do you keep up and ahead of the competition on the chip machines too? Everybody is in this race to advance it. Then again, like the to be sure on NVIDIA earnings always is that everybody, every quarter is like, this is going to be the quarter where they disappoint. They can't keep this up for this long. And every quarter they defy expectations. So I think you have to brace yourself for the idea that they may be able to surprise on the upside again.
Lynn, 20 seconds. What's the next focal point for you as you watch this space?
The chip space or the AI space?
Chip space.
The chip space. More spending on the government side.
Okay.
More being allocated. What I'd really love to know is where the rest of the $12 billion in U.S. chips spending goes. After Micron, you still got a whole lot of money left. And, with the big companies out of the way, you could see a lot of smaller names crowded in that space and make a name for themselves.
Well, as they say always, right? Follow the money, basically. Yeah. All right, Bloomberg News Managing Editor of Technology and Global Security, Lynn, thank you so much. Lynn Dewan joining us here. So semiconductors, Tim, definitely on our mind when it comes to today's trade.
Also on our mind is aftermarket Netflix, of course, because shares have certainly been on a tear over the last 6 months, adding $112 billion in value and making Netflix one of the top performers in the S&P 500, rallying to within about 13% of its highs from 2021, as growing earnings have driven down its valuation. Carol, it's up 25% just since that January report. That was when it flagged its best quarter of growth since the pandemic. So the big question, what's expected in tonight's report?
Yeah, expectations are high. Bloomberg Intelligence technology and media analyst Geetha Ranganathan is with us from our BI headquarters in Princeton, New Jersey. Yeah, it's pretty impressive, and I've got to think, right, Geetha, that the expectations are high. So what is the thinking going into this report for Netflix, and what is really top of mind for you and what you're going to be watching out for?
Yeah, thanks, Carol and Tim. So absolutely right. The bar is very high when it comes to Netflix. I mean, we've seen the company kind of completely right the ship when it comes to, subscriber momentum, right? Just 2 years ago, it was the great Netflix reset, the great correction when they lost subscribers, and that sparked almost a $200 billion, erasing of value. And now they've just completely righted the ship. They have multiple new initiatives in place. And so, you're absolutely right. We saw those 13 million subscriber adds in the fourth quarter. We're going to continue to see that subscriber momentum. Consensus pointing to about 5 million adds for the first quarter. I think it's going to come in much higher than that. And I think what investors are really going to be focused on is, can this subscriber momentum last, or has all the low-hanging fruit been captured? So any commentary that they can provide with respect to, where they are in terms of their password sharing crackdown, or even in terms of their advertising plan, I mean, that's really what investors are going to look to.
Why, Geetha, do you think that Netflix is going to surpass those expectations that are around 5 million net adds? What are analysts not taking into account right now?
Yeah, so we've seen consistent momentum, and this is from a lot of third-party downloads data that we've been tracking, some of the search queries out there, and we've seen actually the downloads data hold pretty steady from that fourth quarter, and that fourth quarter was their biggest fourth quarter. They added about 13 million subscribers, and we've seen the content engagement also remain really, really strong. So they had multiple series, whether it was Avatar or Fool Me Once. They have, the Three Body Problem, which just kind of came out. And if you've just kind of seen the engagement on some of those shows, so Netflix actually publishes, their top 10 report. And we've seen these shows bring in over 250 million hours per series, which is really, really strong, and suggests to us that there is considerable upside and considerable momentum when it comes to the subscriber ad story.
Is that really what kind of sets Netflix apart? I mean, I feel like when we talk with you about the various streaming services, Netflix is in a league all its own and has really kind of figured out a lot. Is it because of its content? What is it that is kind of the special sauce that is Netflix?
Yeah, it is definitely, Carol. It is the breadth and the depth of content. Remember, they have, a very good mix of both originals, and now they're having a lot of licensed content. I mean, last year, of course, the big story was how Suits was one of their biggest shows. That was an old NBC show. And if you just look now, I mean, there are so many different shows from HBO. I mean, the latest one, of course, is Sex and the City, which kind of came just about a week ago. So all of these shows, they're licensing so much of content. And of course, they have a really, really good mix of their own originals. And more than that, it's not just English language content. They have so many non-English language originals that really kind of resonates across their global audiences. I mean, remember, international members make up over 2/3 of their, subscriber base. So I think it plays really well across their whole user base.
Hey, Geetha, if you could, I know certainly that the crackdown on password sharing has helped Netflix, and so has the ad-supported tier, but if you could single out one of those things for being most important to net ads and then finally Netflix's bottom line, which one of those things would it be?
It's definitely the password sharing crackdown, so which they call paid sharing. that actually started happening in the second quarter of last year, and they rolled it across all of their markets. The advertising, they're taking a much more measured approach. They only have it in select markets, only about 10 to 12 markets right now across the globe. And they really haven't disclosed any metrics around that. They said it's going to be a pretty slow build. So definitely when it comes to net ads, it's the password sharing initiative that's really, really helped them.
How sticky are their subscribers? Geetha, I'm always curious about folks who kind of sign on. How long? I mean,
it's a really easy
churn.
service to quit. It's not like quitting traditional cable. You don't call and jump through hoops. It's a very easy service to quit if there's nothing to watch.
Which makes me wonder, like, how much, because it is easy, how much people are kind of, on, off.
Yeah, churn, this burn and churn thing is very common, as you point out, across all streaming services. Having said that, though, Netflix has actually one of the relatively lower churn rates when you compare it to other services. So it's about 3% or so per month, which is not at all bad compared to some of the services which have gone as high as about 9%. So they're able to retain, customers for the most part, just because, again, they have that great content pipeline. So they're always adding something new and something that's edgy, something that people want to watch, part of that whole zeitgeist and, the water cooler conversation moment. So they're able to kind of capture that. And I think, we're kind of going to see that in their subscriber results.
Okay, so we're waiting for those results a little later today. I kind of want to go back to what Carol was asking as we think about the media space in general. Netflix, certainly a first mover here, but lots of competition right now. Who would you say is closest right now out there to cracking Netflix's code?
Disney. And when we talk about cracking the code, it's not just good subscriber momentum. The whole conversation and the whole narrative has really now shifted to profitability. Netflix, of course, is the market leader when it comes to profitability. They already have about $7.5 billion in profits that they posted last year. You compare that to the rest of the whole streaming space, all of the streaming companies combined lost about the same amount, $7.5 billion. But again, so it's taking a long time for everybody to catch up in terms of profitability, but I would say Disney is the closest. Not only do they have fairly good subscriber momentum, they are looking to break even in the next couple of quarters, and then we're going to see them kind of, I wouldn't say replicate Netflix exactly, but they are definitely trying to play catch up, and we'll see them generate fairly good profitability in a relatively short period of time.
Hey, Geetha, just got 30 seconds here. I mean, you got a PE of almost 50, a forward-looking PE of about 35, but there's obviously a lot of metrics when you look at this company, but we let in that it has really outperformed. It's up about 25% shares of Netflix this year. Any miss on any of the key metrics? Would you not be surprised to see some selling in the aftermarket and maybe even tomorrow? Just quickly.
Oh, absolutely not. There will definitely, there is bound to be a pullback if it misses on subscribers or even revenue gains. But again, that could be a buying opportunity.
All right, good. We've seen it before. Geetha, thank you so much. I know we know a busy day for you today. Geetha Ranganathan, she's our technology and media analyst at our Bloomberg Intelligence team, joining us from our BI headquarters out there in Princeton, New Jersey. Netflix shares, though, guys, just a little bit lower. All right, coming up next, we continue here on Bloomberg Business Week, including we get to hear from the Blackstone president and COO, Jonathan Gray. They reported earnings this morning. We take a look at the quarter. That on the other side.
Okay, today I'm going to talk about how to succeed with a startup. Obviously, more than can be said here in 20 minutes, but I will do the best I can. The most important thing, the number one lesson we try to teach startups is that the degree to which you're successful approximates the degree to which you build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it. Startups always ask us for the secret to success. They always want to believe it's something other than this, because this is really hard to do. But this is it. If you can build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it, you have done 80% of the work that you need to be a really successful startup. If you think about the most successful companies you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, you probably found out about them because a friend of yours said, you got to try this, it's great. So this is the bar. Something that people love so much they tell their friends about it. One important indicator for a product like that is a product that's simple to explain and easy to understand. If you can't explain in a few words what you do, and if at least some people don't say, oh, that's pretty interesting, that's usually a mistake. It's usually a sign of unclear thinking or a need that is not big enough.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly. We're Monzo. Give us a go.
See? I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need. Like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
It's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
Another thing that startups need to look for is a market that is either started to undergo or is soon going to undergo exponential growth. I think this is actually related to one of the biggest mistakes investors make when evaluating startups. Investors always say, well, what's your growth rate? We care about the growth rate. Investors will forgive smallish revenue today if it's growing quickly. For some reason, people don't think about markets this way. But if you think about the most important startups, they are the ones that I start in small markets that are growing very, very quickly. 11 years ago, the market for iPhone apps was $0. It's now huge. And I think if you only think about the TAM today, you'll make a big mistake. What you really want to do is identify a market that's going to grow every year and be able to ride that up elevator.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly. We're Monzo. Give us a go.
See? I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need. Like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
It's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
My general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe one stage or two stages ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. What does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down the path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to like build a path towards that. Almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. Think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there, And who do you need to work with? Upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do three things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So it's strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
Last 12 months, it's delivered 17% appreciation. So you've got a lot of happy clients in that area. You also have a secular shift going on, not only in non-investment grade, but in investment grade private credit. You've got insurance companies who are looking to expand what they've done historically. They've done mortgages historically, but now working with folks like us on things like single family mortgages or residential. I'd say also infrastructure lending, that could be digital, green energy, a whole range of activities, asset-backed finance, fund finance. And so there's a broadening of how we serve these insurance clients. There's a broadening of how we're serving pension funds and individual investors. And I think, you know, if you look back over time, if you think about 60-40 for investors, 60 equity, 40 fixed income, a large portion of that 60 has moved to the private area, to alternatives over the last 30 years. And yet in the fixed income bucket, most of that has stayed liquid. And I think we're in the early days of an expansion in terms of alternatives in fixed income in a range of areas. And that gives us a lot of enthusiasm.
That's private credit. On the private equity side, you still see realizations not meeting the mark here. Do you think that the markets will pick up drastically this year, or is it going to be a long time coming before we see deal exits at a more significant scale?
Well, if you think about where we are in this cycle, you know, after 2 years of pretty slow M&A activity, transaction activity, it's picking up, as I noted before. And what you tend to do in this part of the cycle is focus on deployment. You've seen a big pickup from us in deployment the last couple of quarters. I think that'll continue because we think there are attractive opportunities out there across a range of sectors. And then as you think about realizations, you know, getting companies ready to sell, doing IPOs, those sort of things take a bit of time. And what you want to do is do it in a deliberate fashion. Our model means we're not forced sellers of assets. So I think you will steadily see a pickup, but it'll take time. It'll be probably more towards the end of the year and into 2025. Our investors are focused us on maximizing returns, and we think that's the right way to do it, to be deliberate in terms of realizations. But a recovery in capital markets, debt and equity, is an important early sign as we move towards that realization cycle looking forward.
Can you have significant M&A with the interest rate cycle staying this high, given that the expectations have changed so much for the number of rate cuts this year?
Well, interestingly, we have seen changes here. Although short rates are not coming down, we've seen a little bit of a tick up in long rates. Cost of capital has actually come down pretty materially from, say, the October highs. High yield spreads have tightened 100 basis points. Commercial mortgage-backed security spreads probably 125 basis points. And not only has the cost of that debt capital come down, the availability has gone up materially. And so I think that's an important first step. I think that's why you're seeing a pickup in transaction activity. You are right that as the Fed cuts rates, it will be easier for people to do transactions, and you'll see more of a pickup. But even with rates at this more elevated level, I think you'll see more transaction activity given that reduction in cost of capital.
Do you think at least one rate cut this year is achievable, or is even that looking more unlikely?
You know, I think it is achievable. I think the Fed has had some real success on inflation. You know, we had inflation north of 9%. Now it's 3.5%. The pace of disinflation has slowed, but the path is still downward. When we look at our large portfolio, 12,000 real estate assets, 230 companies, what we see is input costs at the manufacturing businesses are pretty flat. We see hotel room rates that have in some cases turned modestly negative. Apartment rents are pretty flat. And when we look at wages, a year ago at our companies, they were growing 5%, now 4%. So I think the Fed will get some data that's positive, give them some room. But I do think they'll be patient and deliberate. So an expectation of fewer cuts, a little more delayed makes sense. But ultimately, I think for investors, what matters is rates will at some point be coming down. And that's a positive. And as investors, particularly us with nearly $200 billion of capital, we want to try to find ways to deploy things before the all clear sign, something we've begun to do, particularly in real estate at scale.
Well, there it is. Sonali Basak with Blackstone President and COO Jonathan Gray just a little bit earlier today after the company reported earnings.
Yeah, great interview there by Sonali. Having said that, among our most read stories on the Bloomberg is another story that certainly plays into the private equity world. Great read, and it basically talks about the biggest buyers and backers, I should say, of buyout firms. They are kind of wielding their ever-growing bargaining power to drive increasingly tough deals, but they're also now saying, you want our investment money. They're saying basically to those buyout firms and the executives, well, then you've got to also show us yours first. So what that means, you've got private equity executives, both at big and small firms, are loading up on more debt and pledging personal assets to appease them. So to raise cash, some of these private equity executives are taking out high interest loans that can charge rates in the mid to high teens, and some of them are being asked to back them with their holiday homes, their cars, their second businesses, and art collections, according to those people in the know and in the reporting. So it's interesting to see that environment happening.
Check out that story. It's today's big take. It's on the Bloomberg terminal and, of course, also at Bloomberg.com. I do, Carol, want to check in on shares of Netflix because we're a little over an hour away, about an hour and a half away from the close, when we do expect those Netflix numbers to cross. Shares down close to 1% right now. Again, expectations are high for it to be a blowout quarter. We just spoke to Bloomberg Intelligence's Geetha Ranganathan, who said that she expects the company to surpass net adds for new subscribers. Estimates are for about 5 million, 4.8 million right now. She expects that number to surpass. I'm interested to hear from commentary, interested to hear the commentary from executives about how they're feeling about people in general, like consumers right now. This could be one of the first things to go.
Cut back?
If consumers are cutting back in this environment. So, regional differences really matter too here.
Yeah, it's a good point. Listen, the stock's up almost 25% year to date. Geetha Ranganathan of our BI team, she's our senior industry analyst covering media, and she writes in her report, her research report, Netflix valuation at 27 times forward EBITDA, no house of cards. And she says that EV to EBITDA multiple, more than twice Disney's and 4 times that of Warner Brothers Discovery. She says it's supported by strong free cash flow, profit, content, subscriber momentum, and buyback. So she says that valuation lives up to snuff. But again, any disappointment, she says, maybe you could see some selling, or some investors might say it's an opportunity.
And again, there are a lot of competitors to Netflix out there, streaming services right now. The big difference between Netflix and the others, well, Netflix is profitable and it has a track record of profitability in recent years. These other companies don't have that yet.
Yeah, a lot of overseas exposure, and that international subscriber is very important, certainly to the company overall as well. Quick check on the markets for you. S&P 500 just down about 16 points. Call it flat on the Dow Jones Industrial Average percentage-wise, just down about 35. NASDAQ 100, a decline of 102 points. So that's a decline of about 0.6%. So the biggest decliner on a percentage basis on this Thursday, and ahead of Netflix earnings, which will be key in terms of potentially equity momentum.
Well, still to come on the program, it's a problem for the Fed in its fight against inflation, and it's a big problem. More of that on the other side.
All right, right now we do want to get an update on world and national news. Back to D.C. we go, and Amy Morris. Amy, all yours.
All right, thanks, Carol. Jury selection in Donald Trump's hush money trial has encountered more setbacks. 2 seated jurors have been excused, one for backtracking on whether she could be impartial, the other over concerns about whether he was truthful about whether he had ever been accused or convicted of a crime. Attorneys now need to pick 13 more jurors to serve on the panel that will decide the first ever criminal case against a former U.S. president. A day after his brief impeachment trial, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas appeared before the Senate Homeland Security Committee to talk about his agency's budget. Now, committee Republicans returned to the same issues that they raised during his impeachment, like crimes committed by undocumented migrants. Senator Rand Paul.
The administration reversed 92 executive orders of the Trump administration. All I can express is disappointment and bewilderment that the Democrats let you get away with it.
Mayorkas says his department has long been denied the personnel and resources to deal with the migrant surge. Guitar legend Dickie Betts, who co-founded the Allman Brothers Band and wrote their biggest hit, Ramblin' Man, has died. Betts was also known for his instrumentals for the Allman Brothers, like their hit Jessica. His manager says Betts died at home in Florida after a year-long battle with cancer. Dickie Betts was 80 years old. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
My general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe one stage or two stages ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. What does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down the path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to build a path towards that. Almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. Think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there, and who do you need to work with, upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do 3 things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
When I was younger, I used to be in bands. I played drums in bands and toured America with them, did a lot of session drumming, recorded albums. So yeah, it was good fun doing the drumming. The only reason I stopped it, well, I still play, but not as serious as I did when I was younger, but drumming doesn't pay the bills. I was never good enough to be able to pay the bills with it, but it was good fun. I started RJF, and the reason I started it was I saw a gap in the market for particular early stage and startup businesses. With the experience that I've got of running businesses, of being a finance director at the very biggest companies in the world to being finance director of small startups, we were looking at providing more than just basic accountancy services. So yes, we'll do all that. We'll do all the basic, all the statutory side of things that you need to do. But there's so much more value that we can add, and I wanted to have my experience to help these startups, because a lot of them don't really know where to go. You can go to your high street accountants and they can do a good job compliance-wise, but you would question whether they've actually been in the fire line of a business. Have you been in a business where you're thinking, how do I pay wages next week? Or business is really successful, what do we do with it next? Or how do we grow it? How do we grow into international territories? Or how do we grow our markets? How do we expand? So a lot of the experience I've seen over the years and seen different types of business in different sectors, I thought, well, it's a real value that I can add to these businesses as opposed to just being an FD, because a lot of these businesses can't afford an FD. But if we can take care of their statutory side of things, the compliance side of things, I'm on hand to be able to help and advise businesses with their growth strategy, or if they're in difficulty, help them through these times.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Red on the screen right now with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, Russell 2000 all declining. S&P right now down 17 at 5,005. That is a drop for the S&P now of 0.3%. We've got the Dow down 37, down 0.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index off by 87 points, down 0.5%. The 10-year 4.64%. The 2-year 4.98%. Spot gold is up $19 the ounce to $23.80. A drop there of 0.8%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.1%, $82.79 a barrel. So a lot of economic data this morning. Also hawkish Fed speak reinforcing speculation that rates will be higher for longer. Netflix will be closely watched after the close of trading. Investors have big expectations for the streaming giant's first quarter results, which bulls hope will support a rally back toward record levels for the stock. Today, Netflix ahead of earnings, reversing earlier gains, down now by 0.8%. Recapping, stocks are lower. S&P down 15, with the S&P at 5,006, down 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, sales of previously owned homes in the U.S. fell in March from a one-year high. It underscores the lingering impact of high mortgage rates and elevated prices. Meantime, a great story by Bloomberg's Matt Boesler today on how rents are the Fed's biggest stumbling block when it comes to taming U.S. inflation. The housing market, of course, incredibly important to the economy and investors. And there are cross currents out there for sure.
Yeah, which is why we knew we wanted to check in once again with Kate Kaminsky. She's Chief Operating Officer of the privately owned and asset and real estate investment company, Walton Global. They've got about $3.3 billion in assets under management, over 90,000 acres under management here in the United States. She's with us once again from Scottsdale, Arizona. Kate, good to have you back. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Doing well. Trying to keep up with everything that's coming up, and it sometimes feels cross currents are coming at us. Last time we talked, late February, you said pretty excited about 2024. Are you still pretty excited about this year? Are you less excited, more excited? Tell me what's changed since February.
Well, looking at the March numbers that came out, I mean, we've definitely seen things plummet a little bit since we last spoke. We're down about 14% for new home starts. But if you look at it year over year, we're still up 21% year over year. So I would say my sentiment hasn't changed from that perspective because we're still seeing, at least for Walton's business, where we really focus in delivering land to new home builders. Companies like Horton put out their earnings today, and I mean they just had one of their strongest quarters ever, and so their stock's up. I think home builder sentiment's up. There's definitely headwinds with what we're seeing with inflation creeping up, mortgage rates creeping up. I think they went over 7 today. So we've got to get that under control. But we remain bullish on the outlook in the new home building space, most definitely.
So what happens if rates don't go down? What happens to your business over the next year, Kate? I mean, there's been lots of talk this year, just in the last few weeks, actually, and a lot in the last few days, that the Fed may not even lower interest rates this year. What does that mean for your business at Walton Global?
Yeah, I mean, we're reading the same economic data points and preparing for the fact that there may not be any rate cuts. We certainly hope that there will be, but especially given it's an election year, I think we're all we have to keep our seatbelt on and go along for this ride. But with that, you know, we're continuing to hold steady in terms of transactions, and think that this is actually going to catapult forward additional transactions for Walton's business, because, you know, what we focus on is providing future land supply to the new home building space. And really we do that through a just-in-time inventory approach. You know, nothing you haven't heard about or we haven't talked about before, whereby the builders are not paying for that land today, they're paying for it in the future. And with Walton's approach, it's when they're actually selling a home to a third party. But so as builders continue to look to preserve cash that they have on hand today, I think that there's going to be even more demand for these unique structures whereby they can defer land buying costs, even development costs. I think we'll start to see a lot more of that over the coming years, and especially this year, so that the builders can take capital that they have on hand, which they have a lot, and use that for things like continuing to buy down mortgage rates, because I don't think that that's going to be a program that we see go away anytime soon, because that's how we're going to get buyers into homes.
Right, and as you did say earlier, U.S. home builder sentiment holding at 51 in April, so it came in line with forecasted numbers by the analyst community. That was a little bit earlier in the week. Having said that, right, you guys do buy land, and then home builders buy that land. Is there any changes in the types of activity that you are seeing, or where they want to be building regionally? We've talked about regional variations with you before, and like all of the activity that's happening down south. What can you tell us? And sometimes the information gets a little bit more nuanced and interesting.
Yeah, you know, again, the data that came out on March, it's showing that we saw that decrease in starts from February over March right across the country. So I'm not going to say that, you know, there's one region in particular that didn't see some softening from February to March. But again, looking at things, you know, year over year, we're still seeing continued increases, strength in the numbers, which I think is leading to that, you know, home builder sentiment and good performance that we're going to see from these builders in Q1. We continue to be extremely focused on that southern half of the U.S. As we continue to see more companies relocate to these markets, job growth within those markets, and population growth, which is, you know, at historic highs. I think that the southern portion of the country is going to continue to be an area that you know, we can really look to for strong results.
Kate, again, to remind everyone of what you guys do, you manage land, you buy it from folks, you manage it, you hold on to it, and then you sell it to the large home builders, some of whom you've already mentioned during our interview. I'm wondering about the other side of the equation, going and acquiring that land right now. What trends are you noticing? Are you able to buy all the land that you want to buy right now? Where are the opportunities? How are prices?
You know, land prices, like everything, have been rising, and it's getting more and more competitive to buy development-ready land, and that's really the key phrase there. I keep driving home this point as we have these interviews, but we're not seeing anything loosen in terms of restrictions on, you know, development ready land across the U.S. Municipalities looking to approve land, and then even more important, the infrastructure injections, you know, spending to get servicing to that land for it to be developed on. But so, you know, all of these factors are making the development-ready land supply even more and more constrained. You know, we've got around 90,000 acres under management. That makes us one of the largest owners of development-ready land in the U.S., but we're continuing to look every week for new acquisition opportunities, because we just think it's going to get tighter and tighter. But so we're certainly advocating for, you know, how can we affect change to get land approved, mostly for high density residential development, to get infrastructure, you know, spending and approvals Right. So that places, like here in Arizona, where we have water challenges, we need to figure that out because the population continues to grow.
Yeah,
here.
I was going to say how much climate change is impacting kind of all of what you do. Just got about 30 seconds left here. What can you tell us on that? That's certainly something we're thinking a lot about here at Bloomberg, and got our Earth Day coming up on Monday, so kind of thinking about that too. How is that complicating the situation? And again, just got about 20 seconds.
Yeah, it's huge. Florida just put some moratoriums on development to really figure out what's happening with wetlands in Florida, and so I would say that it's really region specific and the environmental impact within those markets. But there's a compromise here, and I think we need the government to work with the builders and developers and landowners to figure that out.
Gotta run. Kate, thank you so much. Kate Kaminsky, COO of Walton Global. Coming up, hey, Elon, one of Tesla's biggest bulls, has a message.
Company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Brevin Howard Asset Management is cutting 10% of its workforce, or about 100 employees, to reduce costs as one of the world's best-known hedge fund giants streamlines its rapidly growing operation. Netflix reports after the close of trading today, investors have big expectations for the streaming giant's first quarter results, which bulls are hoping will support a rally back toward record levels for the stock. Netflix right now down 1.2%. Yes, we'll be all over those numbers as they cross. The shares have been on a tear in the past 6 months, adding $112 billion in value. It is about 13% of its record 2021 high. Alaska Air Group expects second quarter profit will top analyst estimates, signaling that the carrier is recovering from a near catastrophe on one of its planes back in January that triggered the temporary grounding of a key Boeing aircraft model. Alaska today up 4.3%. Infosys is forecasting tepid sales growth for the year, a sign that overseas clients are limiting tech spending until the global economy picks up speed. India's second largest outsourcing provider says revenue will grow 1 to 3% on a constant currency basis in the year through March of 2025. That compared with the average analyst estimate of 6.2%. Again, ADRs of Infosys, they are trading lower by 2.9%. And Alphabet's Google has fired 28 employees after they were involved in protests earlier this week against Project Nimbus. That's a $1.2 billion joint contract with Amazon to provide the Israeli government and military with AI and cloud services. And those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. 2 jurors in former President Donald Trump's hush money trial have been dismissed today. One was concerned her identity would be revealed. Another over concerns that his answers in court weren't accurate. A new batch of potential jurors was brought into the courtroom, but when the judge asked them if they cannot be fair and impartial, 48 people, that's about half the pool, raised their hands and they were all dismissed too. After a lunch break, work on seating the jury has resumed. The U.S. and Israel are meeting about a possible Israeli operation in Rafah. National Security Advisor John Kirby.
The main purpose really is to talk about Rafah.
National Security Advisor John Kirby saying the U.S. will share its concerns about a ground offensive in Rafah. Now, this would be the second virtual meeting in recent weeks. An in-person meeting was postponed because of the Iranian attack. The U.S. is hitting Iran with new sanctions targeting Iranian leaders and entities connected to the country's missile and drone program. Long-stalled aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan now back on track to pass Congress as House Democrats lined up to back Speaker Mike Johnson's plan and provide votes to overcome a planned blockade attempt by Republican conservatives. The House is expected to hold a series of votes on Saturday. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek.
All right. Thank you so much, Amy Morris, there in our D.C. bureau. Let's get to our one more thing. There's a couple stories on Elon Musk. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I want to start with this one about a Tesla bull out there who's making a warning. A prominent investor on Wall Street warns that his bullish case about Tesla would be in jeopardy if Elon Musk actually abandons the long-held bid to bring a low-cost vehicle to the masses. Remember, the electric cars coming from China. They're not coming to the U.S. yet, but they're all over Europe. They're all over China, and they are so much less expensive, Carol, than a Tesla. And Tesla says, okay, well, we can do a $25,000 car. We just got to, get it to market.
Yeah, well, David Barron is dispirited by recent reports that Tesla could ditch that goal to bring it to the masses and shift resources to developing a robo-taxi instead. So it's interesting. So he says the Model 2 is a crucial piece of our thesis, I guess their investment thesis. If they stop that, that is an investment thesis changing. He's a portfolio manager at Barron Capital and son of Wall Street veteran Ron Barron, who is certainly well known to the Bloomberg office. He said this in an interview. He oversees the $1.4 billion Barron Focus Growth Fund and says he will be very surprised if Tesla's Model 2 is taken off the table and said growth will accelerate with the new car.
They've been long bullish on the company, we should note. So certainly one to watch. There's also another story that we wanted to touch on about Elon Musk coming out and apologizing. He said that some of the severance packages sent to former Tesla employees as part of its biggest ever workforce reduction were actually too low. Here's what he said in a short email that was sent to employees on Wednesday and also seen by Bloomberg News, this reporting by Dana Hull. Quote, as we reorganize Tesla, it has come to my attention that some severance packages are incorrectly low. My apologies for this mistake. It is being corrected immediately.
Yeah, it's not clear how many former employees are affected. The email, by the way, first reported by CNBC. TSMC email, as our Dana Hull points out, rare show of contrition from Elon Musk, who is contending with lawsuits brought by former Tesla employees and executives over severance in particular. So earlier this week, you might recall that Elon Musk did announce that Tesla would slash global headcount by more than 10%. All of this has to do with that slowing overall growth uptick, if you will, when it comes to EVs. All right, that's going to do it for Tim and me. Hey, if you're watching on TV, Up Close, I should say The Close, is up next.
Yeah, and we got a lot coming up. We're going to talk more about what's going on with housing and why that's proving really sticky for the Fed's fight against inflation. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody. This is Bloomberg Business Week, radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. Well, TV will be back there when we join our TV
everywhere.
colleagues.
Can't get rid of us.
No, sorry.
Even if you try.
Sorry for you. No, this is Bloomberg Business Week. We are watching the markets. We just got about 60 minutes to go here, and we definitely are off our best levels of the session. Down across the board, biggest decline on a percentage basis with the NASDAQ 100. We'll get those numbers in just a moment, but you are seeing the world's biggest bond market extending this month's sell-off. Solid economic readings earlier today. Hawkish Fed speak continuing to reinforce speculation that interest rates will ultimately remain higher for longer. I feel like we got kind of the conviction from that in a big way from Fed Chair Jay Powell earlier this week.
We're at 5,007 on the S&P 500.
Was it just yesterday? Was it just yesterday?
Carol, don't quiz me like this.
Was it
okay?
Jay Powell, guys, yesterday? Was it Tuesday?
No, Jay Powell was Tuesday.
Yeah. It's been,
Tuesday.
it's only Thursday, Lemon.
Yeah.
It's
I was saying that the S&P 500 right now at 5,006.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm wondering to what extent the level 5,000 is some sort of technical level or
technicians often like round numbers.
or
Investors
mental.
often like round numbers.
So we'll see what happens if we do get below that. Again, Abigail pointing out yesterday that the trade started higher and then moved lower. Same thing happened this morning.
Yeah, so we're seeing this over and over again. So in other words, investors come out a little bit optimistic and then it just starts to fall apart. Having said that, coming up, we're going to get to the biggest stumbling block when it comes to taming U.S. inflation, something that's giving the Fed a little bit of a tough time when it comes to its fight against rising prices.
Also, what really happens when you trade in a phone at the Apple Store?
What
Do they
happens?
plant it and then more phones grow from a phone tree?
Does it?
No, we'll find out. There's a big investigation.
This is a great story. Plus, Ozempic. Maybe we should say, oops, Ozempic. This is a great story. It's been our most read on the Bloomberg.
I hear Charlie Pellet laughing after you said that.
Come on, I did well with that.
That was pretty
or
good.
Not, a little cheeky.
Also, Netflix earnings after the bell. Expectations are high. We're going to break down those numbers.
It's the big one today, folks, and we'll see what it does to market momentum. And then we've got episode 8 of The Deal with Alex Rodriguez and Jason Kelly, Hall of Fame wide receiver Larry Fitzgerald. He is on top with them, so we're going to talk with Jason a little bit later on.
All right, first up, a check the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie.
Thank you very much indeed. 58 minutes to go ahead of the closing bell. Equities down for a fifth straight session. That is the longest losing run since October. Right now, the S&P lower by 8 at 5,013. We're looking at a loss right now of just about 0.2%. Dow Industrials up 28 now, higher by 0.1%. NASDAQ down 59, drop there of 0.4%, but we are watching that 5,000 level on the S&P 500. 10-year yield 4.64% with a 2-year at 4.98%. Spot gold up 0.9%, $23.82 a barrel, and West Texas Intermediate crude higher today, up 0.2%, $82.83 a barrel. Bottom line here, stocks are trading mixed. S&P giving up earlier gains, down now by 8 points. So what about the inflation backdrop and the outlook for the Federal Reserve? Kelsey Barrow is Executive Director for Fixed Income at J.P. Morgan Investment Management.
We do expect inflation to be moderating and growth to be moderating. When you look at Q3, we were running at 5%, and then Q4, we were running at 4%. Now Q1, we're running at 3%. These are great growth numbers. They're a great backdrop for corporate fundamentals, but it is still an environment that's moderating. Ultimately, the Fed is in a good place here.
Barrow is interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Television. Coming attractions, Netflix. After the bell, we'll be all over that when that news breaks. Investors have big expectations for first quarter results. Bulls hope it will support a rally back toward record levels for the stock. Netflix right now trading lower by about 0.9%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Can I say this on the radio, Carol?
Well, I don't know.
Okay.
You can always say it once.
The rent, as they say, is too damn high and still increasing too fast.
You're still here.
Okay, I'm still here. Here's
Said
what
it
we
twice.
mean. Here's what we mean, okay?
Yeah.
When inflation peaked above 7% back in 2022, it was relatively broad-based across goods and services. In 2024, with inflation back below 3%, it's no longer the case. What's left of the problem is now mainly about housing.
Interesting. In the new issue of Bloomberg Businessweek, Matt Boesler and Jennifer Epstein write about the Fed's biggest stumbling block in taming U.S. inflation. Matt is Bloomberg News U.S. economy reporter. He joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. Really timely story, makes so sense, and we've talked so much about kind of what makes inflation sticky. Lay it all out for us and what you found in your reporting.
Yeah, so, we're used to kind of hyperventilating around the monthly inflation numbers when they come out every month, and the story's always like, oh, what happened with goods prices? They're falling, or, oh, core services is looking hot. That must mean the labor market's too tight, and so on and so forth. But the truth is, if you really look at the numbers, like the kind of big underlying component that determines the trend of the overall inflation index always comes back to rental inflation. And so we're in a situation now where not only is that usually the most important, but it's especially the most important right now because it's also the component of inflation that has been slowest to come down compared to goods and services and food and energy. And so if you start to dig into those numbers, what's going on there, it looks really interesting on a regional basis where you're seeing, very high rental inflation still in like the Northeast and the Midwest. It's actually coming down very quickly in the West and the South, where in a lot of those cities, they've been building a lot of housing over the last few
figure.
years. Yeah, it's
you increase supply and prices come down.
Welcome to Eco 101.
I want to make sure I get this right. Supply and demand.
Supply and demand.
Okay, so it actually brings me to a serious point because the Fed chair has been asked about this several times over the last couple of years, probably more than several. You follow kind of everything he has to say, but he doesn't have control over zoning. He doesn't have control over where homes are built. The Fed really has a limited toolkit when it comes to this stuff. So what can the Fed do to tackle rent inflation?
Well, that's a really tricky question because typically the way they think about it is, okay, if we raise interest rates, that will reduce demand in the economy, which will reduce demand for housing overall because people have less money to spend on things like housing. But the problem is with housing in particular, sort of that relationship between interest rates and rental inflation, kind of the sign on that relationship, whether it's a positive or negative correlation, can be a little ambiguous because there's also reasons to think that, oh, maybe higher interest rates might, not be great for housing supply, right? If you're trying to finance construction of housing.
We just talked about that with our guest in the last hour, but go ahead.
Right, and so there's things like that. I think most people still believe that on net, the effect is that you raise interest rates and that's going to slow housing on the margin. But it's a lot harder to kind of make that case versus some other more clear-cut kind of components of the inflation index where it makes more sense.
What actually makes up the rent component specifically? Is it rental, any kind of housing? Like, just break it down for me.
Yeah, so it's mostly multifamily housing. There's also a lot of single-family detached housing that is on the rental market, and so this has been kind of a story lately with some of the drama around the inflation numbers over the last few months, and some of these emails that the BLS has been sending out to quote-unquote super users and so on and so forth. Part of the problem with trying to figure out what exactly is going on is that the BLS doesn't publish the weight of single-family versus multifamily housing in the index, so you kind of have to guess.
Because I guess just for a moment, I just think about higher rate environment, you can't afford to buy a home, right? Because the mortgage rates are higher, so you end up renting more, and that just drives up rental prices even more. It's as simple as that, is it, or somewhat?
Well, I mean, so that's part of the reason why it's not clear that raising interest rates will reduce housing demand, because that's one of the big countervailing effects that people, speculate about. There's another kind of more interesting component of this interest rates and rental inflation conversation, which has to do with like the way that the CPI numbers are constructed in particular, which is that We've been talking a lot about these measures of market rents on new leases, right? From Zillow Group, or the BLS is even publishing their own now. And those show that rental inflation has either slowed a lot, or rents are outright declining in a lot of places. The problem is the CPI numbers measure the average rents for all tenants. And I think it's something like 90% of tenants don't move in a given year. And so the CPI numbers are dominated by people who aren't moving. And so it takes some time for, those market rents to get into the kind of like average rents. And one theory that we talk about in the story a little bit is that high interest rates may be affecting the amount of time it takes for market rents to get into the average rent figures, because there's just less turnover, and so the housing stock's turning over less, and therefore those market rents aren't being reflected in the full housing stock as quickly.
I don't mean to ask a question that involves moving goalposts, but Carol and I do talk a lot about a 2% inflation goal and whether or not that is something that needs to be revisited. I think there are a lot of questions about that.
No yet.
But what about just stripping out? What happens when you strip out housing and so-called supercore? Because it actually is pretty significant, and now some analysts are stripping that out when they look at how inflation is moving.
Yeah, so if you do that, inflation is basically back very close to 2%. This housing thing is really like the last, big remaining piece of the issue. If we were stripping out housing, on the core PCE indicator that the Fed likes to look at, we'd be talking about more like 2.2, 2.3% inflation. And you can imagine the conversation would be very different given that we have 5.5% interest rates.
Really different. 30 seconds left. Wrapping up, I'm just thinking about folks who are listening to us and watching us right now. What do you think is it that they have to kind of take away from this as they think about either the investment environment or ultimately what the Fed can or can't do based on this data?
So I think the big thing is to, keep an eye on the rental inflation numbers when we're looking at the monthly inflation statistics in particular, and, think about kind of what's going to get us down back to kind of pre-pandemic run rate for those rental inflation numbers. A lot of people are forecasting that that's going to happen any month now. They've been saying that for a couple months, so we'll just have to see. But if that does happen in the next couple months, then the inflation conversation could change again pretty dramatically.
Yeah, which we've seen some big swings in it already.
Exactly.
Did I mention that Matt's story is featured in the forthcoming issue of Business Week magazine? It's available now on the Bloomberg terminal and at bloomberg.com/businessweek.
It's a great read. Matt Boesler, U.S. economy reporter at Bloomberg News, here in our interactive broker studio. Matt, thank you so much.
Okay, so one major market in business trends. We continue to get updates on.
It's going to solve everything that ails us. I'm convinced.
Yeah, it's sort of the miracle drug, right?
The GLP-1 class of weight loss drugs.
Is it the miracle drug? Well, we're talking about this because, as our own Madison Muller reports, a surprising thing is happening to some women on weight loss drugs who've struggled with fertility issues. They're getting pregnant.
Hey, honey, guess what? It's leading to questions, too, about the safety of medications from Novo Nordisk. We're having some fun, but it's like kind of blowing our mind. But it is leading to questions about these medications, those that are brought to us by Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, especially for those who are using the drug during pregnancy.
Bloomberg News health reporter Madison Muller all over this beat. You know that. She knows that. She's here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. So, Madison, it's not just fertility. You're also reporting that Zepbound from Eli Lilly improved sleep apnea in studies. Carol and I were joking around as we were preparing for the segment, because we've asked you this before. It's kind of like I don't want to say miracle drug. I don't want to say that. But what we are finding is there are a lot of things it can do that it is not intended to do.
Everything except for lowering inflation, apparently. Yet. Yeah. So, I mean, it's crazy. Like, every day I feel like there's something new. And I mean, I thought that the big news of the week was going to be this sleep apnea study. And then while we're, writing and sort of pushing out the sleep apnea study, we find out the Zepbound shortages have gotten worse. And then now there's Ozempic babies. Like, it's just constant. And I think it's because so many people are taking these drugs that we're really like seeing we're seeing this happen in real time. I mean, we are literally finding things out in real time as more and more patients go on the drugs and report things that are surprising and that they didn't study in clinical trials, or that we didn't really even anticipate could be part of this.
You know, I ran into you on the link, and anybody who's been to Bloomberg knows the link is kind of where we get all our food and our coffee. And this morning, I'm like, first of all, we're going to be reaching out to you. And then I was just saying that I do think about, like, as more people take it, right? We talked about this, that the sample is growing increasingly, and it does give us some upside in terms of some, you know, unforeseen consequences, maybe to the upside in a good way. But I also do think, I wonder if we're going to get a really good feel, too, about any of the downsides, but it doesn't feel like, what are the downsides for the most part that we are hearing about all this stuff?
I mean, we've talked about there are obvious side effects that are pretty serious for some people. I mean, vomiting, diarrhea, like really unpleasant things. The FDA and regulators in the EU were looking into suicide, which thankfully was something that they actually determined is not a side effect and is not really linked to these drugs. With the pregnancy thing, I mean, right now, it doesn't look like there are any extremely concerning safety signals emerging, thankfully. But the problem is that the outcomes of pregnancy for people that get pregnant while taking one of these drugs is just not something that's been studied. I mean, it's been looked at for type 2 diabetes. There's been like a couple of studies. Hasn't been looked at for weight loss. And like, there's just a lot of questions and a lot of concerns that some doctors are. This is kind of rare, but we're already seeing these drugs being prescribed to women to help with fertility when the data just isn't there yet.
Wow.
Do they know? That's really surprising to hear. Do they know what it is, perhaps, at least in this preliminary data, that's in these types of drugs that does help with fertility?
Yeah, so what they think is happening is that it's helping to treat one of the leading causes of infertility, so like an underlying problem that causes infertility in women with obesity specifically, which is PCOS. And it's actually the most common hormonal disorder in women, and it's linked to obesity, so it's even more common in women with obesity. And weight loss is known to help improve fertility and improve symptoms of PCOS. So they think that that's what's going on.
But it's similar to sort of the other things that we've talked about, which is, okay, the benefits of losing weight are more than just losing weight. It affects all parts of your body.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, in some ways, it's not so surprising because it's another sort of known health benefit of weight loss. And obviously not everyone, losing weight isn't healthy for everyone. And there are women with PCOS who don't have obesity who probably shouldn't lose weight and who these drugs wouldn't necessarily help. But it's another one of these instances where we're seeing like metabolism and weight is so closely linked to other health outcomes. And this is why these drugs are revolutionary in a lot of ways, because it's changing all of these other health outcomes with weight loss.
No, listen, I feel like we've talked for years, right, about the importance of or the impact of obesity on the health of populations or citizens around the globe. So I get it. Hey, what's the longest that somebody has taken one of these drugs? Because that's the thing I keep thinking about, the longer term implications, and especially as more and more people are taking it seems like for different things. How long has somebody maybe been on a drug, or how long have these drugs really been around?
That's a good question. I mean, that in diabetes, these drugs have been around for like 2 decades, and Ozempic came to market in 2017, so people have been, you know, hypothetically on that drug since 2017 or 2016 if they were in clinical trials. I actually interviewed a woman yesterday who was in the original clinical trials for Eli Lilly's drug Mounjaro, which is the same as Zepbound. So she's probably like one of the people that's been on Lilly's drug for the longest. She's been on it for 4 years. And she said her health has only continued to improve. Like, it's even helped with anxiety and her mood. And so, like, that was pretty interesting.
No side effects? No bad side effects for her?
No.
Wow.
No. Yeah, and she's lost over, I think, like 140 pounds or something like that. It's pretty amazing.
Just in 20 seconds, I want to make sure to touch on this before you go. You mentioned Zepbound. You have a story out that said there's an outage deepening right now.
Yes. Yeah, that's been a huge issue. I mean, it's a big issue for the company. They're investing billions in ramping up production, but it just is not happening quickly enough for like the demand for these products. And it's really affecting patients though, because they are totally, I mean, some people are driving like 3-4 hours to find a pharmacy that has the drug in stock. It's really bad.
All right, interesting, obviously, and it feels like this is another one of those stories. Every day you come in, there's something new on it. Bloomberg News health reporter Madison Muller. So appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Hey, coming up next, what really happens when you trade in that iPhone at the Apple Store? That is on the other side. This is Bloomberg Business Week on Bloomberg Radio.